The lighthouse keeper's evening ritual. The afternoon sun hung low over Beacon Point, casting long shadows across the weathered stone of the lighthouse. Thomas Weatherby stood at the base of the tower, one weathered hand resting against the cool wall as he looked out toward the horizon. The sea was calm today, a gentle rolling of gray-green waters that spoke of peace rather than peril. He was 73 years old, and he had been keeping this light for 47 of those years. The lighthouse had become more than his work. It had become the rhythm of his life, the measure of his days, the companion of his solitude. "Well then," he said aloud, though there was no one to hear him but the gulls. "Time to begin." It was 4:30 in the afternoon, precisely the time he began his evening ritual every single day. Thomas was a man of routine, not from rigidity of spirit, but from a deep understanding that the sea respected reliability. Ships depended on the light. Sailors trusted in its consistency. And so he had made himself as dependable as the tides, as regular as the turning of the earth. He began, as he always did, at the storage shed beside the lighthouse. The small wooden building leaned slightly to the east, shaped by decades of coastal wind, but it was sturdy and dry. Thomas pulled open the door. It squeaked in the same spot it had squeaked for 15 years, and stepped inside. The shed smelled of oil and rope, of canvas and salt-preserved wood. Everything had its place. On the left wall hung his cleaning supplies, soft cloths folded in neat squares, bottles of polishing solution, brushes of various sizes, each labeled and organized. On the right stood his fuel cans, always kept full, always checked and rechecked. Thomas selected 2 soft cloths and a bottle of lens polish. He tucked them into the deep pockets of his canvas work jacket, then reached for the kerosene can. It was nearly full. He'd refilled it just yesterday, but he lifted it anyway, gauging its weight. Satisfied, he set it down and picked up a smaller can, one that held perhaps a gallon. This would be easier to carry up the stairs. He stepped back outside and carefully closed the shed door, securing the latch. A piece of driftwood leaned beside the entrance, smooth and gray from years of sea and sun. He'd found it on the beach 3 summers ago, and had never quite decided what to do with it, but it felt right there, like an old friend waiting. The lighthouse door was painted red, a bright, cheerful red that Thomas repainted every 3 years. It stood out against the white stone of the tower, visible even from the mainland on clear days. He pulled the door open and stepped into the cool dimness within. The ground floor of the lighthouse was Thomas's living space, though living might be too grand a word for it. It was functional, simple, sufficient. A narrow bed stood against the curved wall, made up with military precision, a wool blanket tucked tight. A small table and single chair occupied the center of the room. A wood stove, cold now in the mild autumn weather, waited in the corner. Shelves lined one section of wall, holding tins of food, jars of preserves, a few books with cracked spines and sun-faded covers. A ship in a bottle sat on the topmost shelf, the only decorative item in the space. Thomas had made it himself 30 years ago during a particularly long winter. The ship was a schooner, 3-masted, sails full. He'd named her Eleanor, though he'd never written the name on the hull. Some things were private, even from oneself. Thomas set the kerosene can on the floor beside the base of the spiral staircase. The stairs wound upward through the center of the tower, iron steps worn smooth by decades of climbing. He would make several trips up and down this evening, as he did every evening. His knees ached sometimes, more than sometimes, if he was honest, but the pain was familiar, almost friendly in its constancy. He began to climb, his hand trailing along the central post, his feet finding each step without conscious thought. 147 steps from bottom to top. He'd counted them so many times he could climb them in complete darkness and know exactly where he was at any moment. The tower walls were thick, 3 feet of stone that had withstood countless storms, endless wind, the patient erosion of salt air. Small windows punctuated the spiral at regular intervals, letting in shafts of golden afternoon light that moved across the steps as Thomas climbed. Dust motes danced in the beams, hypnotic and peaceful. At step 73 he paused, as he often did, at a window that looked northeast. From here he could see a portion of the rocky coast, a stretch of beach, and beyond that, the edge of the small town of Harborside. Smoke rose from a few chimneys. A fishing boat was returning to port, trailing a small wake. Life continuing in its ordinary way. Thomas remembered when there had been 3 lighthouses along this stretch of coast. Now there was only this one. The others had been decommissioned, deemed unnecessary in the age of GPS and radio beacons. There had been talk a few years back of automating this lighthouse too, of replacing Thomas with a timer and an electric bulb. But Beacon Point was remote, and the bureaucracy moved slowly, and somehow Thomas remained. He suspected it was partly because no one wanted to be responsible for the decision, partly because the annual inspection always showed everything in perfect working order, and partly, he liked to think, because someone understood that some things were worth preserving not for their necessity but for their rightness. He continued climbing. At step 112, he passed another window, this one facing west. The sun was lower now, beginning its descent toward the horizon. The sky was clear, no clouds, no haze. It would be a beautiful sunset, and the visibility would be excellent. A good night for the light. Finally, he reached step 147. The top. The lantern room was Thomas's favorite place in all the world. It was a circular space, perhaps 12 feet in diameter, surrounded entirely by windows. The lens dominated the center, a Fresnel lens, a magnificent piece of engineering consisting of concentric rings of glass that gathered and focused light into a powerful beam. It stood nearly 6 feet tall, mounted on a rotating mechanism that was itself a marvel of 19th-century craftsmanship. The lens caught the afternoon light and broke it into rainbows that danced across the glass walls. Thomas stood for a moment, as he always did, simply appreciating the beauty of it. The lens was the heart of the lighthouse, the reason for everything. He set down his cleaning cloths and polish, then moved to the windows and began opening the vents. Each window had small panels that could be opened to allow airflow, to prevent the lens from overheating when the lamp was lit. Thomas opened them in sequence, moving clockwise around the room, each one releasing with a soft click. Fresh air flowed in, cool and salt-tinged, carrying the cry of gulls and the eternal whisper of the waves. Thomas breathed deeply. This air, this light, this place, it had become part of his very substance over the decades. He could no more imagine leaving it than he could imagine ceasing to breathe. He returned to the lens and began his inspection. This was always the first task, before any cleaning or preparation. He needed to assess its condition, to look for any cracks or chips, any accumulation of salt spray, any damage from the previous night's operation. Thomas moved slowly around the lens, his eyes trained by long experience to catch any imperfection. His hands moved over the glass, feeling for roughness, for any irregularity. The glass was cool and smooth under his fingertips, solid and reliable. "Looking good, old friend," he murmured. "Looking good." He found a small spot of salt residue on the eastern face, likely from spray carried by yesterday morning's wind. He made a mental note. That would need extra attention during the polishing. The rotating mechanism beneath the lens needed checking too. Thomas knelt, his knees protesting, and examined the gears and bearings. Everything appeared properly lubricated. The rotation was powered by a weight that descended through the center of the tower, like a grandfather clock. Thomas wound it every evening, a crucial part of the ritual. He reached for the winding crank, fitted it into its socket, and began to turn. The mechanism clicked with each rotation, a satisfying mechanical sound that spoke of precision and purpose. Thomas counted the cranks. It took exactly 63 full rotations to wind it completely. At 63, he stopped, removed the crank, and hung it on its designated hook. The sun was perceptibly lower now. Thomas estimated he had perhaps 90 minutes until he needed to light the lamp. Time enough for the polishing, for the preparations, for the evening routine to unfold at its proper, unhurried pace. Thomas removed his canvas work jacket and hung it on a peg near the door to the lantern room. Beneath it he wore a soft flannel shirt, faded blue from countless washings, comfortable and worn in all the right places. He rolled up his sleeves methodically, first the right, then the left, folding each precisely 3 times. From his pocket, he withdrew the first of his cleaning cloths. It was made of a special soft cotton, tightly woven but gentle enough not to scratch the delicate glass. He'd ordered these cloths from a supplier in Boston, the same supplier his predecessor had used, and that keeper's predecessor before him. Some traditions were worth maintaining. He poured a small amount of the polishing solution onto the cloth, not too much, just enough to dampen it. The solution had a clean, sharp smell, vaguely citrus. Thomas had tried other polishes over the years, modern formulations that promised superior results, but he always returned to this one. It worked, and that was enough. Starting at the top of the lens, Thomas began to polish. His movements were gentle, circular, covering each section of glass with careful attention. The light coming through the lens shifted and danced as he worked, throwing moving patterns across the walls and ceiling of the lantern room. This was meditative work that allowed his mind to wander while his hands performed their practiced task. Thomas had polished this lens thousands of times, tens of thousands perhaps. The repetition had long ago moved beyond tedium into something else, something almost sacred. Each time he cleaned the lens, he was maintaining not just a piece of equipment, but a lifeline, a guardian, a promise made to every sailor who ventured into these waters. As he worked, his mind drifted to the early days, when he'd first come to Beacon Point. He'd been 26 years old, freshly trained, newly assigned. The previous keeper, old Samuel Morrison, had stayed on for 2 weeks to show him the routines, to pass along the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of lighthouse keeping. "The lens is everything," Samuel had told him, his gnarled finger pointing at the great apparatus. "You can let other things slide now and then, a dusty floor, an unwashed dish, but never the lens. The lens must be perfect, always. Lives depend on it." Thomas had taken those words to heart. In 47 years, he had never once failed to clean and polish the lens properly, had never once allowed it to be anything less than pristine when the lamp was lit. He moved down to the next section of glass, his cloth tracing smooth circles. A smudge disappeared, a slight haze cleared, and the glass became crystalline, almost invisible. This section done, he moved to the next. Through the windows, Thomas could see the sea stretching endlessly toward the horizon. A few small boats dotted the water, lobster boats, probably, checking their final traps before heading in for the evening. He recognized one of them, a white-hulled boat with a blue stripe. That would be Martin Kelly's boat, the Sea Sprite. Martin had been fishing these waters for 30 years, knew them nearly as well as Thomas did. Thomas had known 3 generations of Kellys. Martin's grandfather, Patrick, had been keeper of the South Lighthouse back when it still operated. Martin's father, James, had been a harbor master in Harborside. And now Martin fished, continuing his family's relationship with the sea in his own way. Sometimes Thomas wondered if Martin ever looked up at the lighthouse and thought about the light, about the keeper who maintained it. Probably not. The light was just there, as constant as the stars, as reliable as dawn. That was how it should be. A good lighthouse keeper was invisible, present only in the steady turning of the beam, night after night, year after year. The cloth in Thomas's hand had become dirty, streaked with the residue of salt and dust. He folded it to expose a clean section, and continued his work. The afternoon sun slanted more steeply through the windows now, creating long shadows across the lantern room floor. As Thomas polished, he began to hum softly, a habit he'd developed over the years, something to accompany the rhythm of his work. The tune was an old sea shanty, one his father had taught him when Thomas was a boy. His father had been a merchant sailor, gone for months at a time, returning with stories of distant ports and foreign seas. "Why do you always leave?" Thomas had asked him once, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, resentful of another departure. His father had knelt down, looked him in the eye. "Because the sea is in my blood, Tommy. Some men are made for the land, for solid ground beneath their feet. But some of us need the water, need the horizon, need to see what's beyond the edge of the world. You'll understand someday." Thomas had understood, though not in the way his father meant. He'd found his relationship with the sea not by sailing upon it, but by watching over it, by standing at this fixed point and helping others navigate its dangers. The sea was in his blood too, but his calling was to stay, not to go. He finished the upper sections of the lens and moved to the middle ring. This was the thickest part of the glass, where the prismatic elements were most pronounced. It required extra care, extra attention to reach into all the grooves and facets. The salt deposit he'd noticed earlier came away easily under his careful polishing. He held the cloth up to inspect it, a white crust of dried salt visible against the fabric. He'd need to rinse this cloth before using it again. Thomas kept a bucket of fresh water in the lantern room for exactly this purpose. He moved to the bucket, which sat in the corner near the door, and dipped the cloth into the cool water. He wrung it out carefully, then spread it over the railing to dry. From his pocket he produced the second cloth, clean, fresh, ready for use. With this new cloth, he returned to the lens and began working on the lower sections. These caught less spray, usually, but accumulated dust and required just as much attention. Thomas's back was beginning to ache from bending, but he ignored it. The discomfort was temporary. The lens was eternal, or near enough. A gull landed on the railing outside the lantern room, a large herring gull with gray wings and a yellow beak. It cocked its head, looking at Thomas with one bright black eye, then opened its beak and let out a long, mournful cry. "Good evening to you too," Thomas said to the bird. The gull regarded him for a moment longer, then launched itself back into the air, wings spread wide, catching the wind. Thomas watched it glide away, effortless and free. He'd always envied birds their flight, their ability to see the world from above, to traverse miles without effort. But then they would never know the satisfaction of keeping a light, of maintaining this faithful vigil. Every creature had its place, its purpose. Thomas returned his attention to the lens. The lower sections were nearly complete now. Just a few more passes, a bit more attention to detail, and it would be perfect. As he worked, he thought about the lamp itself, which rested in the center of the lens assembly. It was a relatively modern lamp, installed perhaps 20 years ago, replacing an older kerosene system. This one still used kerosene, but had a more efficient burner, a better wick system. It produced a powerful, steady light, and with the magnification of the Fresnel lens, that light could be seen for nearly 20 miles on a clear night. 20 miles. Thomas tried to imagine that sometimes, tried to picture the beam stretching out across the dark water, a finger of light reaching into the void. Ships out there, miles away, would see it first as a faint glow, then as a distinct flash as the lens rotated. Every 15 seconds, the light completed one full rotation, sending out a pulse of illumination that identified this lighthouse specifically. Every lighthouse had its own pattern, its own signature. Beacon Point signature was simple: flash, 15 seconds of darkness, flash. Sailors knew these patterns. They studied them, memorized them, relied on them to know exactly where they were along the coast. The light didn't just warn of danger, it provided certainty, location, identity. In the darkness of the sea, it said, "You are here. You are known. You are safe." Thomas finished the final section of the lens and stepped back to admire his work. The glass gleamed, catching the late afternoon light and transforming it into 1,000 points of brilliance. Perfect. It was perfect. He folded his cleaning cloth and returned it to his pocket. Tomorrow he would wash both cloths, hang them to dry, have them ready for the next evening's polishing. Every tool had to be maintained, every item kept in proper order. Now he moved to the windows themselves, to the glass walls that surrounded the lantern room. These needed cleaning too, though not with the same intensity as the lens. Still, salt spray and dust could accumulate, reducing visibility and potentially blocking some of the light. Thomas had a different cloth for this purpose, slightly coarser, and a different cleaning solution. He applied it to the first window and began wiping in long vertical strokes. The glass cleared, becoming transparent, and the view of the sea expanded, sharpened, became more vivid. From up here, the world seemed both vast and manageable. Thomas could see miles of coastline, miles of ocean, could watch the weather approaching from far away, could observe the patterns of waves and wind. But it was all contained within this circle of windows, this room at the top of the tower. The infinite made comprehensible. He worked his way around the room, cleaning each window panel in turn. The sun was noticeably lower now, perhaps 45 minutes from touching the horizon. The sky was beginning to take on that particular quality of late afternoon light, a golden clarity that made everything seem more defined, more present. When all the windows were clean, Thomas performed one final inspection of the lens. He walked around it slowly, checking every angle, making sure he hadn't missed any spots, confirming that everything was as it should be. Satisfied, he nodded to himself. "Well done," he said quietly. "You'll shine bright tonight." Thomas descended the spiral staircase with the steady, measured pace of long practice. His hand trailed along the central post, his feet finding each step automatically. 147 steps down, the same as going up, but somehow the descent always felt quicker, as if gravity pulled not just his body but time itself. At the bottom, he paused to catch his breath. The exertion wasn't what it used to be. There had been years when he could climb those stairs 3 or 4 times in succession, without feeling winded. Now at 73, he needed these small moments of rest. He didn't begrudge them. Age was simply another constant, like the tides, like the turning of the earth. He picked up the small kerosene can he'd left by the stairs and made his way back outside. The air had cooled slightly, and the quality of the light had shifted. That golden late afternoon glow now had a touch of amber to it, the beginning of evening's long approach. Thomas walked around the perimeter of the lighthouse, checking the grounds as he did every evening. This was part of the ritual too, less critical than maintaining the lens, but important nonetheless. A lighthouse keeper's domain extended beyond the tower itself, encompassing the entire station, every building and pathway and piece of equipment. The grass around the base of the lighthouse was trimmed short. Thomas had mowed it just 2 days ago with his old push mower. The blade needed sharpening. He could hear it in the way the mower had sounded, a slight raggedness to the cut. He'd tend to that tomorrow, in the morning, during the after-breakfast work period. The flagpole stood 20 yards from the lighthouse, a simple wooden pole painted white. No flag flew from it at the moment. Thomas only raised the flag for official occasions or when he spotted a vessel in distress. The rest of the time, the pole stood bare, a marker of potential rather than present purpose. Near the flagpole stood a small weather vane, a copper cutout of a ship that had long ago turned green with verdigris. It pointed west, indicating the wind direction. The wind itself was light, barely enough to keep the ship pointed steady. A gentle evening, then. Good conditions for visibility. Thomas continued his circuit. The storage shed stood secure, its door properly latched. The small vegetable garden beside it, Thomas's one concession to decoration and self-sufficiency, showed the first signs of autumn decline. The tomato plants were still producing, though slowly now, their fruit smaller and less abundant than the summer crop. The lettuce had bolted weeks ago. The beans were finished. He'd planted this garden his first spring at Beacon Point, partly for fresh food, partly for something to tend during the long, quiet days. Over the years it had become another part of the rhythm, another marker of time's passage. Spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter rest. The garden asked nothing more than attention and care, and in return it gave sustenance and purpose. Thomas made a mental note to harvest the remaining tomatoes tomorrow. There weren't many, perhaps a dozen still ripening on the vines, but they shouldn't go to waste. He could make a simple sauce, store it in jars, have it for the winter months ahead. Beyond the garden, a narrow path led down toward the rocky beach. Thomas walked this path now, the kerosene can swinging lightly in his hand. The path was steep in places, requiring careful footing, especially on the sections where exposed rock made the surface uneven. Thomas knew every inch of it, knew where to step and where to avoid, which stones were solid and which might shift. The beach itself was more rock than sand, a tumbled collection of stones worn smooth by endless waves. Larger boulders marked the high tide line, covered in barnacles and dried seaweed. The tide was going out now, retreating toward its low point, exposing tidipools and stretches of dark, wet stone. Thomas didn't come down to the beach every evening. The climb back up was taxing, but he tried to visit at least twice a week. The beach was where he found things, collected things, observed the sea's moods and offerings. Today he wasn't looking for anything in particular, but his eyes scanned the tiddleline automatically. Years of beachcombing had trained him to spot anything unusual, anything of interest. Driftwood, glass floats from fishing nets, shells, occasionally pieces of wreckage from boats that had foundered far offshore. A piece of blue rope, frayed and salt-stiffened, lay among the rocks. Thomas picked it up, examined it. Good rope once, probably from a lobster trap. Too damaged to be useful now. He set it back down. The sea would reclaim it eventually, break it down further, distribute its fibers into the great cycle of the ocean. A cluster of mussels clung to a rock near the water's edge. Thomas observed them with quiet appreciation. These creatures, filtering seawater for nutrients, living their entire lives in this narrow zone between land and sea. They asked so little from the world, and yet managed to persist, generation after generation. He turned and looked back up at the lighthouse. From here it seemed impossibly tall, a white tower rising against the sky, solid and permanent. The lantern room at the top caught the sun, glowing like a jewel. In a little while that glow would be his doing, his lamp, his light reaching out across the waters. A wave larger than the others rushed up the beach, foam hissing across the stones. It reached within a few feet of where Thomas stood, then retreated, pulling small pebbles with it in a rattling cascade. The sound was ancient, eternal, the same sound that had accompanied every lighthouse keeper who had ever stood on the spot, the same sound that would continue long after Thomas was gone. He thought about that sometimes, the continuity of this place, this purpose. Lighthouse keeping was one of the oldest professions, dating back thousands of years. The technology had changed, the methods had evolved, but the fundamental mission remained unchanged. To keep a light burning, to warn of danger, to guide the lost home. Thomas checked his pocket watch. 5:30. The sun would set in approximately 40 minutes, though the exact time varied day by day as the seasons shifted. In summer, sunset came late, after 9 o'clock, and Thomas's evening ritual stretched long and leisurely. In winter, darkness came early, sometimes before 5, and the ritual compressed, became more efficient. He preferred the longer evenings, truth be told. There was something satisfying about the gradual transition from day to night, the slow dimming of the light, the way colors deepened and shadows lengthened. Winter's abrupt darkness felt rushed, almost violent in its suddenness. Thomas began climbing back up the path toward the lighthouse. His breathing came harder on the ascent, and he paused twice to rest, standing still and letting his heart rate settle. No rush. Everything in its proper time. Back at the top of the path, he stopped at the hand pump that stood near the storage shed. The pump drew water from a deep well, cold and clean and reliable. Thomas worked the handle, hearing the familiar squeak and groan of the mechanism, feeling the resistance as the pump pulled water up from far below. Water gushed from the spout, clear and cold. Thomas set down his kerosene, Kenan cupped his hands beneath the flow, catching the water and bringing it to his face. He splashed his cheeks, his forehead, the back of his neck. The cold was shocking and refreshing, washing away the slight sheen of sweat from his walk. He pumped again, filling his cupped hands and drinking deeply. The water tasted of minerals and stone, the flavor of the earth itself. Thomas drank until his thirst was satisfied, then pumped one more time, rinsing his hands thoroughly. From his pocket he pulled a handkerchief, white cotton, worn soft, and dried his face and hands. The handkerchief went back into his pocket. Every item returned to its place, every action completed properly. Thomas picked up the kerosene, and carried it back into the lighthouse. The interior felt cool after being outside, and his eyes needed a moment to adjust to the dimmer light. He set the can down near the base of the stairs, then moved to his small living area. The wood stove stood cold and dark. Thomas hadn't needed heat for weeks now. The autumn weather had been mild, and the stone walls of the lighthouse held warmth well. But he checked it anyway, opening the small door and peering inside. The ash pan needed emptying. He'd do that tomorrow morning, add it to the compost pile behind the storage shed. On the shelf above the stove, his teapot waited. Thomas lifted it down carefully. It was ceramic, glazed a deep blue, and had been his mother's before it was his. One of the few possessions he'd brought with him to Beacon Point all those years ago, one of the few things that connected him to the life he'd left behind. The teapot had a small chip on the spout, damage from a moment of carelessness a decade ago when Thomas had set it down too hard on the stone counter. He'd been upset with himself for days after, angry at his clumsiness. But the chip hadn't affected the teapot's function, and over time he'd come to see it not as damage but as character, as evidence of the teapot's long use and survival. Thomas filled the teapot with water from a covered bucket near the door, water he'd pumped fresh that morning. He set the teapot on his small camping stove, a propane-powered burner he used for cooking. A match scratched against the striker, flared bright, and Thomas lit the burner. Blue flame licked around the base of the teapot. While the water heated, Thomas selected his tea. He kept a small collection in a tin on the shelf, black tea mostly, a few herbal varieties for occasional variation. Tonight he chose a simple black tea, nothing fancy, just good reliable leaves that would steep into a strong, comforting brew. He measured the tea into a strainer, using a small spoon, getting the amount exactly right. Too little, and the tea would be weak and unsatisfying. Too much, and it would be bitter, overpowering. Thomas had learned the precise measure through years of practice. The water began to steam, and Thomas watched it with the attention of someone who understood that small details mattered, that there was a right way to do even the simplest tasks. When the first small bubbles appeared at the bottom of the pot, not yet a rolling boil, but close, he removed it from the heat. Water that was too hot would scorch the tea leaves, make the brew harsh. Thomas poured the water over the strainer, filling his cup 3/4 full, leaving room for the steam to escape and the tea to breathe. The liquid was pale at first, then began to darken as the leaves steeped, turning amber, then brown, then a deep mahogany. Thomas set a timer, a simple mechanical timer that ticked audibly in the quiet of the lighthouse. 4 minutes for the tea to steep, not 3, not 5. 4 minutes produced the ideal strength, the perfect balance of flavor and bitterness. While he waited, he moved to the small wooden table that served as his dining surface, his desk, his workspace for any task that required a flat surface. The table had been here when he arrived, left by Samuel Morrison, or perhaps by keepers even before Samuel. The wood was scarred and stained, marked by decades of use, but it was sturdy and level. Thomas pulled out his chair, the only chair in the room, and sat down. From the table's single drawer, he withdrew a small leather-bound journal. The cover was worn smooth by handling, the corners rounded and soft. This was his logbook, though it served purposes beyond the official records he was required to keep. He opened the journal to the current page. His last entry had been this morning, noting the weather conditions, the state of the sea, any ships observed during the night. The official logbooks were stored in a cabinet and would eventually be sent to the Lighthouse service for their archives. But this personal journal was his alone, a place where he recorded not just facts but observations, thoughts, the small details that made each day distinct from all the others. Thomas uncapped his fountain pen, another possession from his earlier life, a gift from his father on Thomas's 18th birthday. The pen still wrote smoothly, though he'd replaced the nib twice over the years and refilled it with ink countless times. He kept a bottle of black ink on the shelf, always ensuring he had a spare bottle in reserve. Running out of ink would be unacceptable. The timer rang, a soft, pleasant chime. Thomas rose, removed the strainer from his cup, and set it on a small plate to drain. The tea was exactly the right color, exactly the right strength. He returned to the table with his cup, feeling the warmth of it in his hands, breathing in the earthy, slightly bitter aroma. He took a sip. Perfect. The tea was hot but not scalding, strong but not harsh. It spread warmth through his chest, a small comfort that marked this transition point in the evening ritual. Thomas set down the cup and began to write in his journal. October 17th, evening. Clear skies, wind light from the west. Sea calm with gentle swells. Visibility excellent. Estimate 20 miles or more. 3 fishing boats observed returning to harborside between 4:45 and 5:15. Recognized Martin Kelly's Sea Sprite among them. He paused, took another sip of tea, then continued. Lens polished and prepared. All equipment in good order. Small salt deposit on east face, now removed. Rotation mechanism functioning smoothly. Kerosene supply adequate. These were the facts, the essential information. But Thomas continued, adding details that had no official purpose but satisfied some need in him to record, to remember. The light this afternoon was particularly beautiful, that golden quality that comes in autumn when the air is clear and the sun angles low. Saw a herring gull at the lantern room, probably the same one I've been seeing for the past week. It seems unbothered by my presence. Garden showing autumn decline. Will harvest remaining tomatoes tomorrow. The beans are finished for the season. I've been thinking about what to plant come spring. Perhaps more carrots this year. They store well and require little maintenance. He paused again, pen hovering over the page. There was something else he wanted to record, some observation or thought that lingered at the edge of his mind, but he couldn't quite grasp it. After a moment, he set down the pen and took another drink of tea. The light coming through the small windows of the ground floor had shifted again, becoming more amber, more horizontal. Thomas could tell without checking his watch that it was approaching 6 o'clock. The sun would be very low now, perhaps 15 minutes from touching the horizon. He closed his journal and returned it to the drawer, capped his pen and set it beside the journal. Everything in its place. Then he sat quietly, drinking his tea, allowing himself these few minutes of rest before the next phase of the evening ritual. The lighthouse was very quiet. Outside, the eternal sound of the waves provided a constant background, but inside, the thick stone walls muffled the noise to a gentle whisper. Thomas could hear the ticking of his timer, which he'd left running. He could hear his own breathing, steady and slow. He could hear the faint creaking of the building settling, adjusting to the cooling evening air. This quiet was one of the things he treasured most about lighthouse keeping. Not silence. The lighthouse was never truly silent, but quiet, a reduction of the world's noise to only the essential sounds. After 47 years, Thomas had grown so accustomed to this quiet that he found the noise of towns and cities almost unbearable during his rare visits to civilization. Once a year, in late spring, Thomas took a week of leave and traveled to Portland. It was required by the Lighthouse service, Every keeper needed to take at least 1 week away from the station annually to ensure they hadn't become too isolated, too removed from human society. Thomas went because it was required, not because he wanted to. Portland was overwhelming. The traffic, the crowds, the constant assault of sound and activity. Thomas would stay in a small hotel, visit a few shops to purchase supplies he couldn't get through the mail, perhaps eat at a restaurant. But mostly he would count the days until he could return to Beacon Point, to the lighthouse, to the quiet and the routine and the light. This past May, during his required leave, he'd stood on a busy Portland street corner, surrounded by people rushing past, cars honking, music blaring from shop doorways, and he'd felt a profound sense of dislocation. He was a stranger in his own species, more comfortable with gulls and waves than with human beings. Was that healthy? Probably not, by most people's standards. But Thomas had long ago stopped measuring his life by other people's standards. He had his work, his purpose, his routine. He was content. That was more than many people could say. He finished his tea and carried the cup to the small basin near the door. He poured water from the bucket over the cup, washing away the tea residue, then set it on a cloth to dry. The teapot, now cool, received the same treatment. Both would be ready for tomorrow morning's tea, beginning the cycle again. Thomas checked his watch. 6:05. Time to light the lamp. He picked up the kerosene can and began climbing the stairs again. 147 steps up. His legs protested slightly. This was his third ascent of the evening, but he maintained his steady pace. No rushing, no pausing. Steady and reliable, like everything else about the ritual. The lantern room was bathed in the deep gold of approaching sunset when Thomas emerged from the stairwell. The cleaned lens sparkled. The polished windows framed a sky that was beginning to show hints of color. It would be a spectacular sunset, Thomas could tell. The clarity of the air, the absence of clouds, all the conditions were right. He set the kerosene can down carefully and moved to the lamp itself. The lamp sat in the center of the lens assembly, a brass and glass construction that looked almost delicate despite its sturdy function. Thomas opened the access panel and examined the wick. It was trimmed properly. He'd done that this morning, as part of his routine maintenance, and showed even wear. Good. He unscrewed the fuel reservoir and picked up the kerosene can. This part required care and attention. Spilled kerosene would be dangerous and difficult to clean. Thomas poured slowly, watching the level rise in the reservoir, stopping when it reached the indicator line. Not too full. That could cause problems with the burner. Not too little. The lamp needed to burn all night without running dry. The kerosene had a distinctive smell, sharp and chemical but not unpleasant. Thomas had been around it so long that the smell had become comforting, associated with purpose and duty. He capped the reservoir and set down the can, then closed the access panel. Now came the moment he performed every single evening, the moment that gave meaning to everything else. Thomas reached for the matches he kept in a small waterproof container on a shelf. He selected one match, closed the container, and struck the match against the striker. The match flared, bright and sudden in the dimming light. Thomas watched it for a moment, ensuring it was burning steadily, then lowered it carefully to the lamp's wick. The wick caught immediately, flame spreading across its width, and Thomas adjusted the flow of kerosene until the flame burned steady and bright. He replaced the lamp's glass chimney, which protected the flame from drafts and focused the heat upward. The flame strengthened, burning clear and yellow in the center with hints of blue at the base. Perfect. Thomas stepped back and watched as the lens began to do its work. The flame's light, ordinary and small on its own, was gathered by the concentric rings of glass, focused, magnified, transformed into something powerful. The beam projected outward through the windows, invisible in the remaining daylight, but already powerful, already reaching. He moved to the rotation mechanism and engaged the clutch. With a soft click, the lens began to turn, powered by the weight he'd wound earlier. The rotation was smooth and steady, one complete revolution every 15 seconds. As it turned, the concentrated beam swept around the horizon, creating the characteristic flash pattern that identified this lighthouse. Flash. 15 seconds. Flash. 15 seconds. Flash. Thomas watched the rotation for a full minute, counting the flashes, confirming the timing was correct. Everything was as it should be. The light was lit. The watch had begun. With the lamp lit and the lens rotating smoothly, Thomas allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. This moment, every evening, was the culmination of all the preparation, all the care, all the attention to detail. The light was burning. Ships at sea could now find their way safely past the rocks and shoals that made this stretch of coast so treacherous. He pulled his watch from his pocket and noted the exact time, 6:14 p.m. He would record this in the official log later. The lighthouse service required precise documentation of when the lamp was lit each evening and extinguished each morning. Over the years, Thomas's logs had become models of accuracy and consistency. The sun was touching the horizon now, a blazing orange disk that seemed to balance on the edge of the world. The sky around it had become a canvas of color, gold near the sun itself, shading to orange, then pink, then a pale blue that deepened toward purple overhead. Not a cloud marred the display. Thomas moved to the western windows and stood watching the sunset. This was a privilege he granted himself every evening when weather permitted. A few minutes simply to observe, to appreciate, to be present for the daily drama of the sun's departure. The ocean reflected the sky's colors, becoming a mirror of gold and orange. The waves caught the light and threw it back, each swell crowned with molten brightness. The fishing boats, now safely returned to harbor, were invisible from this distance, but Thomas could imagine them in the small marina, crews unloading their catches, washing down their decks, securing lines for the night. As he watched, the sun seemed to accelerate in its descent. The bottom edge touched the water, then sank into it. The disk became a half circle, then a crescent, then just a brilliant point of light. And then it was gone, slipped beneath the edge of the world, leaving only its afterglow in the sky. The light from the lens became suddenly more apparent. What had been invisible in the daylight now stood out clearly, a powerful beam sweeping across the darkening sky, visible as a faint cone of light where it caught particles of moisture and dust in the air. Thomas turned from the window and began his post-lighting inspection. This was another critical part of the ritual. He needed to confirm that everything was functioning correctly, that the lamp would burn steadily through the night, that the rotation would continue without interruption. He checked the fuel level again, unchanged as it should be. The wick was burning evenly, no guttering or smoking. The flame height was correct. The glass chimney was already beginning to accumulate a slight heat shimmer, but showed no signs of soot or cracking. The rotation mechanism clicked softly as it turned, a rhythmic sound that Thomas found deeply comforting. He put his ear close to the gears, listening for any irregularity, any grinding or squeaking that might indicate a problem. Nothing. The mechanism was smooth and well lubricated, functioning exactly as designed. He checked the windows, ensuring that none of the vents had closed, that airflow remained adequate. In winter, managing the temperature in the lantern room became more complex. Too much cold air could affect the lamp's performance, but too little ventilation could cause dangerous buildup of fumes. Tonight, with the mild autumn weather, it was simple. The vents were open, fresh air circulated, all was well. Satisfied, Thomas descended the stairs once more. The kerosene can he left in the lantern room. He would bring it down in the morning, when he extinguished the lamp. Down the spiral stairs, hand on the central post, feet finding each step. At the bottom, he paused and looked upward. Through the open center of the spiral staircase, he could see all the way to the top, to the lantern room far above. The light from the lamp created a warm glow that filtered down the shaft, illuminating the iron steps and stone walls in soft, shifting light as the lens rotated. It was beautiful. After 47 years, it still struck Thomas as beautiful. He moved to his small kitchen area and began preparing his evening meal. Thomas was not an elaborate cook. Living alone in a lighthouse didn't encourage culinary experimentation, but he took care to eat properly, to maintain his health and strength. The lighthouse service had drummed into him during his training that a keeper's first duty was to remain fit for duty, and that meant proper nutrition and adequate rest. Tonight's meal would be simple: a can of fish stew, heated and served with crackers. A bit of cheese. One of the tomatoes from the garden, sliced. Tea, of course. He opened the can of stew with his manual can opener. He'd learned long ago not to depend on electric gadgets in the lighthouse. Power was unreliable, supplied by a small generator that ran only a few hours each day. Thomas had grown accustomed to doing things the old way, the manual way. It was more reliable, and reliability was the cornerstone of lighthouse keeping. The stew went into a small pot on his camping stove. While it heated, Thomas sliced the tomato on a wooden cutting board, one of the few pieces of kitchenware he'd acquired over the years. The tomato was ripe, deep red, with that particular sweetness that only garden-grown tomatoes possessed. He arranged the slices on a plate and sprinkled them with a pinch of salt from his salt cellar. The stew began to bubble, and Thomas stirred it with a wooden spoon. The smell was rich and savory: fish, potatoes, some herbs he couldn't quite identify. It wasn't the finest meal he'd ever eaten, but it was hot and nourishing, and that was sufficient. He poured the stew into a bowl, set it on the table along with his plate of tomatoes, a few crackers arranged on another small plate, and a wedge of sharp cheddar cheese. Then he made himself a fresh cup of tea, this time choosing a milder blend, something that wouldn't interfere with sleep later. Before eating, Thomas lit a candle and placed it in the center of the table. He didn't need the light. There was still enough daylight filtering through the windows, and he had an oil lamp he could use if necessary. But the candle was part of the ritual, a small gesture toward ceremony, toward making this meal something more than just refueling. He sat down and began to eat slowly, methodically. The stew was hot and good. The tomato was sweet and acidic, a perfect complement. The cheese was sharp and aged, crumbling slightly as he cut it. The crackers provided texture and a subtle saltiness. As he ate, Thomas reflected on the day. It had been a good day, uneventful in the best possible way. The weather had cooperated. The equipment had functioned properly. The routine had unfolded as it should. These were the days that made up a lighthouse keeper's life. Not dramatic rescues or terrible storms, but quiet, consistent, reliable days of maintenance and vigilance. People who didn't understand lighthouse keeping often thought it must be boring, this solitary life with its endless repetition. And perhaps it would be boring for some people, for those who needed constant novelty and stimulation. But Thomas had learned long ago that routine was not the enemy of meaning. Quite the opposite. Routine created the structure within which meaning could flourish. People who didn't understand lighthouse keeping often thought it must be boring, this solitary life with its endless repetition. And perhaps it would be boring for some people, for those who needed constant novelty and stimulation. But Thomas had learned long ago that routine was not the enemy of meaning. Quite the opposite. Routine created the structure within which meaning could flourish. Every evening, he cleaned the lens. The task was the same, but each evening the lens might have different residues, different smudges, different patterns of salt spray. Each evening, his hands performed the same motions, but his mind could wander, could observe, could think and remember and imagine. Every evening, he lit the lamp. The task was identical, night after night after night. But each lighting was unique because each was necessary, each was purposeful, each represented the continuation of a promise made to every sailor on the sea. There was something deeply satisfying about this, something that Thomas suspected most people never experienced in their complicated, chaotic lives. He had found his place, his purpose, and he fulfilled it with absolute consistency. In a world of uncertainty, he was a constant. In a world of change, he was reliable. He finished his meal and sat for a moment with his hands wrapped around his teacup, feeling its warmth. The candle flame danced slightly in a draft he couldn't feel, throwing small shadows across the table. Outside, the last light was fading from the sky. True night was approaching. Thomas rose and carried his dishes to the basin. He washed each item carefully, dried them, and returned them to their places on the shelf. The pot went back on its hook. The cutting board stood propped against the wall. The spoon and knife went into the small drawer where he kept his utensils. With the dishes done, Thomas moved to the window and looked out. The darkness was nearly complete now, just the faintest glow remaining in the western sky. The beam from the lighthouse swept across the landscape with each rotation, illuminating brief flashes of grass, stone, the path leading down to the beach. Out to sea, darkness was absolute. No lights visible, no ships apparent. But Thomas knew they were out there, somewhere beyond the horizon or closer in along the coast. Fishing boats working through the night. Cargo vessels making their way between ports. Perhaps a yacht or pleasure craft, though those were rare this late in the season. All of them would see his light. All of them would know where they were, would know to stay clear of the rocks, would feel perhaps a small measure of comfort in that steady, reliable flash. Flash. 15 seconds. Flash. Thomas checked his watch. 7:15. He had a few hours yet before sleep. The evening was still young, and there were tasks to occupy his time, quiet activities that filled the hours between lighting the lamp and retiring for the night. Thomas moved to his bookshelf, running his fingers along the spines of the volumes arranged there. He had perhaps 40 books in total, a modest collection accumulated over decades. Some he'd brought with him when he first came to Beacon Point. Others had been gifts, ordered through the mail, or discovered in second-hand shops during his annual trips to Portland. The books were a mix of practical manuals, maritime history, a few novels, and some poetry. Thomas wasn't a voracious reader. He often went weeks without opening a book, but he valued having them there, appreciated knowing he could reach for one whenever the mood struck him. Tonight, he selected a volume of Robert Frost's poetry. The book was old, its dust jacket long since lost, the binding cracked but still holding. Thomas had read it many times over the years, returning to certain poems again and again, finding new meanings or simply taking comfort in the familiar words. He carried the book to his chair, lit the oil lamp on the table. The candle had burned down to a stub, and settled in to read. The lamp cast a warm, steady glow, sufficient for reading but not harsh. Thomas adjusted the wick slightly, getting the light just right. He opened the book at random, letting it fall to wherever it wanted. The pages separated at a poem called Birches. Thomas smiled slightly. This was one of his favorites, though he couldn't have said exactly why. Something about the imagery, perhaps, or the rhythm of the language. He read slowly, silently, letting the words form in his mind without speaking them aloud. When I see birches bend to left and right slash across the lines of straighter, darker trees. The poem spoke of a boy swinging on birch trees, bending them down through play and climbing. But it also spoke of ice storms and the way nature shaped things, and of the desire to get away from Earth for a while and then return. Thomas had never swung on a birch tree. His childhood had been coastal, largely treeless, but he understood the sentiment. The longing for escape combined with the need to return, to be grounded. The lighthouse was both his escape and his ground. He'd left behind a life that hadn't suited him, a brief career as a merchant's clerk in Boston, a city that had felt suffocating and meaningless, and come here, to this remote point of land and stone. In doing so, he'd found not freedom from responsibility, but a different kind of responsibility, one that felt right and true and necessary. Thomas read the poem through to its end, then sat for a moment with the book open in his lap, thinking about nothing in particular, simply present in the moment. The oil lamp flickered slightly. Through the small window, he could see the beam from his lighthouse sweeping past, regular as a heartbeat. After a while, he turned to another poem, then another. He read for perhaps half an hour, not hurrying, sometimes rereading a particular line that struck him, sometimes pausing to look up and let his mind wander before returning to the page. At 8 o'clock, by his watch, Thomas set the book aside and rose from his chair. Time for the first evening check. This was another part of the routine. He would climb to the lantern room 3 times during the night to ensure everything remained in proper working order. The first check at 8, the second at midnight, the third at 4 in the morning, just before dawn. The stairs seemed steeper at night, or perhaps Thomas was simply more tired. He climbed steadily, counting steps out of habit, though he no longer needed to. At the 63rd step, he paused to catch his breath. At the 120th, he paused again. Then the final ascent to the top. The lantern room at night was a different place than during the day. The lamp burned bright in the center, its flame steady and strong. The lens gathered that light and sent it out into the darkness, visible as a brilliant beam that swept around and around, never pausing, never stopping. Thomas checked the fuel level first. It had dropped slightly, exactly as it should have after 2 hours of burning. He noted the level mentally, calculating how much fuel would remain by morning. More than enough. The lamp would burn through the night without issue. The wick showed even burning, no carbon buildup, no irregularities. The glass chimney had accumulated a slight haze from the heat, but nothing concerning. Thomas made a note to clean it during the midnight check. The rotation mechanism continued its steady clicking, the lens turning with perfect regularity. Thomas timed it with his watch, counting the seconds. 15 seconds per rotation, exactly as it should be. The weight that powered the mechanism had descended perhaps 3 feet down the shaft, still plenty of height remaining before it would need rewinding. He moved to the windows and looked out into the night. The darkness was complete now, absolute. No moon yet, it would rise later, near midnight. The stars were beginning to appear, faint at first, then growing stronger as his eyes adjusted. The beam from the lighthouse swept across the sky, briefly illuminating clouds he hadn't noticed earlier, high and thin. Thomas stood at the window for several minutes, scanning the horizon for lights. There, far to the southeast, perhaps 10 miles out, a vessel's running lights were visible. Red and green, indicating it was heading northeast, parallel to the coast. A cargo ship, probably, making its way toward Portland or perhaps Boston. He watched until the lights disappeared, whether from distance or from the ship changing course he couldn't tell. Then he scanned the rest of the horizon. Nothing else visible. The fishing fleet had come in hours ago, and recreational boats avoided these waters at night. The temperature in the lantern room had risen slightly from the heat of the lamp, but the ventilation kept it comfortable. Thomas checked each vent, ensuring none had somehow closed or become blocked. All were open, all functioning properly. Satisfied that everything was as it should be, Thomas descended the stairs once more. His knees protested more on the descent than the ascent, something about the angle, the way the joint had to bend. He took his time, careful with his footing in the dim light. Back in his living quarters, Thomas prepared his bed for the night, though he wouldn't sleep for several hours yet. He pulled back the wool blanket, smoothed the sheets, fluffed the single pillow. Everything ready for when the time came. He returned to his chair and the book of poetry, but found he couldn't quite focus on reading. His mind was restless, wandering. Sometimes this happened, especially on clear, quiet nights like this one. The solitude that usually felt comfortable took on a different quality, became something more like loneliness. Thomas set the book aside and instead pulled out a piece of paper and his fountain pen. Writing sometimes helped when he felt this way. Not journal entries, those were factual, observational, but letters. Letters he would never send, written to people who were gone or who had long since forgotten him. He began to write, "Dear Father, I thought of you today while polishing the lens. You would have appreciated the precision of it, the way every piece of glass must be perfectly clean for the light to shine at its brightest. You were always particular about things being done properly." Thomas paused, pen hovering over the paper. His father had been dead for 15 years now, buried in a cemetery in Boston that Thomas had visited once, during one of his required leave periods, and then never returned to. His mother had died even earlier, when Thomas was in his 30s, young enough that her death had seemed impossibly unfair. He continued writing. "The lighthouse is doing well. All equipment functioning as it should. The garden produced well this year. You would have been proud of the tomatoes. I'm using the techniques you taught me, the ones you learned from your father. Sometimes I wonder what you would think of the life I've chosen. You wanted me to be more ambitious, I know. To make something of myself in the city, to climb the ladder of success. But I think you would understand that I found my own kind of success here. I'm good at this work. I'm reliable. Ships depend on me. I hope you would be proud." He signed the letter simply Thomas and set it aside. He wouldn't read it again, wouldn't keep it. In the morning, he would tear it up and throw the pieces into the sea. But the act of writing it had settled something in him, had eased the restlessness. Thomas looked at the clock on his shelf, a wind-up clock that kept reliable time. 9:15. Still hours until the midnight check. He considered reading more, but decided against it. Instead, he turned down the oil lamp and sat in the dimness, listening to the night. The lighthouse had its own sounds at night, different from the daytime sounds. The stone walls contracted slightly as they cooled, producing occasional soft pops and creaks. The wind, so gentle earlier, had picked up slightly, producing a low whistle as it moved around the tower. The waves, always present, seemed louder at night, or perhaps he simply paid more attention to them. And beneath it all, the steady clicking of the rotation mechanism far above, audible if he listened carefully, a mechanical heartbeat that marked the passage of time. Thomas thought about time, about the way it moved differently here than it did in the rest of the world. In cities, time was measured in hours and minutes, in schedules and appointments, in the rush from one obligation to the next. Here, time was measured in tides and sunrises, in the slow progression of seasons, in the patient accumulation of days that became weeks, became months, became years. 47 years. Had it really been that long? Sometimes it felt like he'd arrived at Beacon Point only yesterday, could still remember with perfect clarity his first night climbing these stairs, his first time lighting the lamp under Samuel Morrison's watchful eye. Other times, it felt like he'd always been here, like his life before the lighthouse had happened to someone else, in some other world. Thomas rose from his chair and moved to the window, looking out into the darkness. The beam from the lighthouse swept past regularly, illuminating brief moments of the landscape, a patch of grass, a section of the path, the weathered wood of the storage shed. Everything else remained in darkness, visible only as vague shapes against the slightly lighter sky. He thought about all the nights he'd stood at this window, thousands upon thousands of them, each night unique in its details, different weather, different sea conditions, different ships passing, yet all essentially the same. The same ritual, the same duties, the same quiet vigil. Some people would find that monotonous, oppressive even. Thomas had known keepers who couldn't handle it, who'd requested transfers after only a year or two, who'd spoken of cabin fever and isolation and the desperate need for human contact. The Lighthouse service had learned to screen candidates carefully, to look for men who could not just endure solitude but embrace it. Thomas had never struggled with the solitude. If anything, he'd struggled with the opposite during his brief attempts at living in cities, at working in offices surrounded by people. The constant chatter, the meaningless small talk, the way people seemed to talk without saying anything of substance, it had exhausted him in a way that 47 years of lighthouse keeping never had. Here, he could go days without speaking to another person, and it felt natural, right? When he did speak, to the rare visitor, to the quarterly inspector, to the supply boat captain, the words had weight and meaning because they were few and chosen carefully. He checked his watch. 9:40. Time was moving slowly tonight, as it sometimes did. Thomas decided to make himself another cup of tea, something to occupy his hands and give structure to the waiting. The ritual of tea-making was soothing. Filling the kettle, lighting the burner, measuring the leaves, waiting for the water to reach the right temperature. Each step required attention, and attention kept the mind from wandering into uncomfortable territory. While the water heated, Thomas tidied his small living space, though there was little to tidy. He straightened the blanket on his bed. He aligned the books on his shelf, making sure they stood in neat rows. He swept a small amount of dust from the floor near the door, using a hand broom and dustpan he kept for this purpose. These small acts of maintenance, of keeping things orderly and clean, were important. Not just for practical reasons, but for psychological ones. In the isolation of the lighthouse, it would be easy to let things slide, to stop caring about cleanliness and order. But Thomas had learned that maintaining standards, even arbitrary ones, helped maintain mental clarity and purpose. The water boiled and Thomas made his tea. He chose chamomile this time, an herbal blend that would help him sleep when the time came. He carried the cup to his chair and sat, cradling the warmth in his hands. Through the window, he noticed the moon beginning to rise, a waxing gibbous that cast silver light across the water. The sea, which had been invisible in the darkness, now became visible again, a vast expanse of gentle swells that reflected the moonlight like hammered metal. Thomas watched the moon's ascent, the way it seemed to pull itself free of the horizon, climbing into the sky. The moon was near full. In another 3 or 4 days it would be perfectly round. Full moons made his night watches easier, providing natural light that supplemented the beam from the lighthouse. They also brought higher tides. Thomas made a mental note to check the tide tables tomorrow, to be aware of when the spring tides would peak. Not that it mattered much, the lighthouse stood well above even the highest storm surge, but it was part of his responsibility to know, to be aware of all the rhythms and cycles that affected this small piece of coast. He sipped his tea slowly, feeling the warmth spread through him, feeling the chamomile begin its gentle work of relaxation. His body knew the routine as well as his mind did, knew that after the midnight check, he would sleep for 4 hours, then wake for the pre-dawn check, then sleep again until sunrise. His sleep had become segmented this way over the years, broken into pieces by the need to monitor the light. Some people would find that exhausting, but Thomas had adapted. He'd learned to fall asleep quickly, to sleep deeply during those brief windows, to wake alert and ready for his duties. His body had become a finely tuned instrument, calibrated to the needs of lighthouse keeping. The tea finished, Thomas washed the cup and set it to dry. He checked his watch again. 10:30. Still 90 minutes until the midnight check. He considered reading more poetry, but decided instead to work on a small project he'd been neglecting. From a shelf near his bed, Thomas retrieved a piece of driftwood he'd collected several weeks ago. It was a beautiful piece, about 2 feet long, worn smooth by the sea into flowing organic curves. He'd been thinking about carving it into something, though he wasn't sure what yet. Perhaps a gull in flight. Perhaps just an abstract form that followed the wood's natural shape. He carried the driftwood to his table, along with a small set of carving tools he kept wrapped in oiled cloth. Carving was a hobby he'd taken up about 10 years ago, after finding a book on wood carving at a second-hand store in Portland. He wasn't particularly skilled at it, but he enjoyed the process, the way it occupied his hands and allowed his mind to settle. Thomas examined the wood carefully, turning it over, running his hands along its surface, trying to see what form might be hidden within it. The wood had a natural grace, a sweep to it that suggested movement, flow. Yes, a gull would be appropriate. A gull with wings spread, riding the wind. He selected a small knife from his tool set and began to make preliminary cuts, removing rough spots, beginning to define the general shape. The work required concentration. The knife was sharp, and driftwood could be unpredictable, its grain twisted by years in the water. He worked slowly, carefully, making small cuts and frequently pausing to examine his progress. The rhythmic motion of carving was meditative. Cut, pause, examine. Cut, pause, examine. Tiny curls of wood fell onto the table, pale against the dark surface. The smell of the wood was pleasant, mixed with salt and age and something indefinable that spoke of the sea. As Thomas worked, his mind wandered to other carvings he'd completed over the years. A small boat that sat on his shelf. A dolphin he'd given to the supply boat captain. Several abstract pieces he'd eventually thrown into the sea, feeling they weren't quite right. The carving wasn't about creating perfect art. It was about the process, about having something to do with his hands during the long evening hours. The wood began to take shape. Not a gull yet, but the suggestion of one. The sweeping curve of wing, the tapered body. Thomas worked on the head next, carefully shaping the beak, trying to capture that fierce, purposeful look that gulls had when they flew. Time passed without his noticing. When he finally looked up, his watch showed 11:40. Nearly midnight. Nearly time for the second check. Thomas set down his carving and wrapped his tools back in their cloth. He examined his work. It was coming along nicely, though it would take many more evenings to complete. He placed the partially carved driftwood on the shelf, positioning it where he could see it and remember to work on it again tomorrow. He stood and stretched, feeling his back crack slightly, feeling the stiffness in his fingers from gripping the carving knife. His body was complaining more these days, little aches and pains that hadn't been there even 5 years ago. Age was making itself known, reminding him that he wouldn't be able to do this work forever. But that was a thought for another time. For now, he had duties to perform. Thomas climbed the stairs once more, his third ascent of the evening. The steps seemed even steeper now, or perhaps he was simply more tired. He paused more frequently, letting his breathing settle, letting his heart rate slow. No rush. The lamp wasn't going anywhere. The lantern room was warm when he emerged from the stairwell, heated by hours of the lamp's burning. But not uncomfortably so. The night air flowing through the vents kept it tolerable. Thomas went through his checklist: fuel level, wick condition, glass chimney, rotation mechanism. Everything functioning perfectly. He checked the fuel level more carefully this time, comparing it to his mental calculation of how much should have burned. Very close, perhaps an ounce difference, well within normal variation. The lamp would have enough fuel to burn until dawn without issue. The glass chimney had accumulated more haze, as he'd expected. Thomas took a soft cloth and carefully cleaned the inside surface, being cautious not to touch the hot glass with his bare hand. The cloth came away slightly blackened, and the chimney became clear again, allowing the light to shine unimpeded. Outside, the moon had climbed higher, now perhaps a third of the way up the eastern sky. Its light painted the sea in silver and shadow, revealing the texture of the waves, the patterns of current and wind. The beam from the lighthouse seemed less dramatic with the moonlight competing, but it was still powerful, still clearly visible. Thomas scanned the horizon, looking for ships. Nothing visible tonight. The cargo vessel he'd spotted earlier was long gone. The fishing fleet wouldn't return until tomorrow evening. The waters around Beacon Point were empty, or appeared to be from his vantage point. But appearances could be deceiving. A ship could be just beyond the horizon, or tucked in close to shore, where the angle made it invisible from the lighthouse. This was why the light had to burn every night, regardless of whether Thomas could see any vessels. The light wasn't for the ships he could see, it was for the ships he couldn't. Thomas completed his inspection and stood for a moment at the window, simply absorbing the night. The air coming through the vents was cool now, carrying the scent of the sea, salt and seaweed, and that indefinable smell of deep water. He breathed deeply, filling his lungs, then exhaled slowly. These moments of stillness were precious to him. Not because anything remarkable was happening, but precisely because nothing was. The world continued in its patterns, the sea rolled in its ancient rhythms, the light swept around in its faithful circle. All was as it should be. He descended the stairs, his legs heavy now with the accumulated fatigue of the evening's climbs. At the bottom, he checked his watch. 12:15. He would sleep now for approximately 4 hours, then wake for the pre-dawn check. Thomas moved to his bed and sat on its edge, unlacing his boots methodically. Left boot, then right boot, each set beside the bed within easy reach. His socks came off next, heavy wool socks that had kept his feet warm during his trips up the cold iron stairs. He hung them over the back of his chair to air out overnight. He stood and removed his flannel shirt, folding it and placing it on the chair. His undershirt he kept on. The lighthouse grew cold in the hours before dawn, and he'd learned to sleep partially clothed for comfort. His trousers came off and were folded and placed with the shirt. Thomas had never been particularly modest. There was no one to see him, but he maintained certain standards nonetheless. Even in solitude, perhaps especially in solitude, it was important to behave with dignity and order. He pulled back the wool blanket and slipped between the sheets. The bed was narrow but comfortable, the mattress shaped to his body after decades of use. The pillow was flat. Thomas had never liked thick pillows, and positioned exactly as he preferred it. He lay on his back, hands folded on his chest, and closed his eyes. Sleep didn't come immediately. It rarely did during the first few minutes. His mind needed time to settle, to release the day's thoughts and concerns, to prepare for rest. He could hear the clicking of the rotation mechanism far above, faint but audible in the stone silence of the lighthouse. The sound was as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, a constant companion through all these years. Sometimes, when he traveled away from the lighthouse during his annual leave, he found himself unable to sleep in the profound silence of a hotel room, missing that reassuring mechanical rhythm. Outside, a gull called, a lonely sound in the darkness. Thomas imagined it perched somewhere on the rocks, perhaps hunting for small creatures in the tidipools, perhaps simply announcing its presence to the night. His breathing slowed, deepened. His body began to relax, muscle by muscle, releasing the tension accumulated through the evening's work. His mind drifted, thoughts becoming less focused, more dreamlike. He thought of the lens, gleaming in the darkness above him, sending its light out across the water. He thought of sailors on distant ships, seeing that light, taking comfort in its presence. He thought of all the nights he'd done this, all the mornings he would continue to do it, until age or circumstance finally made it impossible. What would happen then? The lighthouse service had been talking for years about automation, about replacing men with machines. Eventually it would happen. Thomas wasn't naive enough to think otherwise. But perhaps not in his lifetime. Perhaps he would be the last keeper of Beacon Point, the final link in a chain stretching back over 100 years. There was both sadness and honor in that thought. Sadness that the tradition would end, that future generations would know lighthouses only as historical curiosities, automated stations requiring no human presence. But honor in being the last, in carrying that responsibility to its conclusion, in ensuring that the light never failed under his watch. Sleep was coming now, pulling at him like a tide. His thoughts fragmented, became disconnected images and sensations. The feel of the polishing cloth on glass, the smell of kerosene, the taste of chamomile tea, the sound of waves on stone. Thomas's breathing became regular, slow. His hands relaxed, no longer folded but resting at his sides. His face softened, the lines of concentration and care smoothing into the peaceful expression of sleep. The lighthouse stood watch while its keeper slept. The lamp burned steadily, the lens rotated faithfully, the beam swept around and around, never pausing, never faltering. Above the sleeping keeper, above the patient machinery, the light kept its promise to the darkness and the sea. Thomas woke suddenly, completely alert, at 3:55 in the morning. This was the skill he'd developed over decades, the ability to wake at almost the exact moment he intended, without need for an alarm. His internal clock had become synchronized with the rhythms of the lighthouse, calibrated to its needs. He lay still for a moment, listening, assessing. Everything sounded normal, the rotation mechanism still clicking, the waves still washing against the rocks, the wind still whistling softly around the tower. But he needed to check, needed to confirm with his own eyes that all was well. Thomas sat up and reached for his trousers in the darkness. He knew exactly where they were, had placed them precisely, so he could find them without fumbling. He dressed quickly, efficiently, pulling on his clothes in the same order he always did. His boots went on without being laced. He would tighten them if he needed to go outside, but for a simple trip up the stairs, this was sufficient. He stood, stretched briefly, and began the climb. The pre-dawn was the coldest time, and Thomas felt it as he ascended the stairs. The stone walls radiated the night's accumulated chill, and his breath formed faint clouds in the air. He climbed steadily, his body now fully awake, his mind alert and focused. In the lantern room, the lamp still burned brightly, though the fuel level had dropped considerably. Thomas checked it carefully, still sufficient for another 2 hours, enough to last until dawn when he would extinguish it. Perfect! The wick showed slight carbon buildup now, a black crust at its tip. Thomas made a note to trim it fresh in the morning after extinguishing the lamp. The glass chimney had more haze, but nothing concerning. Everything was functioning as it should. He looked out at the night. The moon had crossed most of the sky, now descending toward the western horizon. The stars had wheeled overhead, the constellations shifted from their positions earlier in the night. Orion was visible now in the southeast, rising as it did every autumn, the faithful herald of winter's approach. The darkness seemed absolute, but Thomas knew it was already beginning to soften. Not visibly yet, that would come in another hour or more, but the earth was turning toward the sun, the horizon preparing for the first hint of dawn. Thomas scanned for ships and found one, a large vessel far to the south, heading westward. Its lights were clear and bright, probably a tanker or large cargo carrier. He watched it for several minutes, tracking its progress, confirming that it was maintaining a safe distance from the coast. It would pass well clear of the rocks, well clear of any danger. Satisfied, he descended once more. His body was stiff from sleep, his movements slightly less fluid than they'd been earlier in the evening. He made his way carefully down the stairs, one hand firmly on the central post, taking his time. Back in his living quarters, Thomas decided not to return to bed. The second sleep period would be brief, only an hour or so until he needed to begin his morning routine, and sometimes it was more disruptive than restful to sleep for such a short time. Instead, he relit the oil lamp and moved to his table. The partially carved driftwood sat on the shelf where he'd left it, but he wasn't in the mood for carving. Instead, he retrieved his journal and opened it to a fresh page. The fountain pen scratched softly across the paper as Thomas wrote. October 17th to 18th, night watch. Lamp lit at 6:14 p.m. Evening checks at 8 p.m., 12:15 a.m., and 4 a.m. All equipment functioning normally. Clear skies throughout the night. Moon waxing gibbous near full. Wind light and variable. Sea calm with gentle swells. Vessels observed. One cargo ship at 6:30 p.m., heading northeast, approximately 10 miles offshore. One large vessel, possibly tanker, at 4:05 a.m., heading west, approximately 15 miles offshore. Both vessels maintaining safe distances. He paused, pen hovering over the page. Then added, a quiet night. Peaceful. The light burned steady and true. Thomas set down his pen and closed the journal. Through the window, the darkness was indeed beginning to soften, though the change was subtle, visible only to someone who'd spent decades watching for it. The stars were beginning to fade, the brightest ones still visible, but the dimmer ones already washed out by the approaching dawn. Thomas sat quietly at his table, watching the slow transformation of night into day. This was one of his favorite times, these quiet minutes before dawn when the world held its breath, suspended between darkness and light. He rose and moved to the small stove, deciding to make coffee. Tea was his usual beverage, but there was something about early morning that called for coffee stronger, more bracing quality. He kept a tin of coffee grounds on the shelf. Not fancy coffee, just a simple, robust blend that could be made in his small percolator. He filled the percolator with water, measured coffee into the basket, and set it on the burner. The flame caught with a soft whoosh, and Thomas adjusted it to a low heat. Coffee shouldn't be rushed. It needed time to brew properly, to develop its full flavor and strength. While the coffee percolated, Thomas moved through his small space, performing the quiet tasks of early morning. He straightened the blanket on his bed, folding it with military precision. He checked the water bucket near the door, noting that it was less than half full. He would need to pump fresh water after sunrise. The coffee began to make its familiar bubbling sound, and the rich, bitter aroma filled the lighthouse. Thomas breathed it in, appreciating the smell as much as the drink itself. Smell and taste were closely linked, and the anticipation of coffee was part of its pleasure. He poured a cup, black, no sugar, no milk, and carried it to the window. The sky was definitely lighter now, the quality of darkness shifting from absolute black to a deep blue-gray. The horizon was beginning to separate from the sea, a barely perceptible line of demarcation. The stars were disappearing rapidly now, only the brightest still visible. Venus hung low in the east, brilliant and steady, the morning star. Thomas watched it, knowing it would be the last to fade, holding out against the coming sun until the very last moment. The beam from the lighthouse was still visible, but seemed weaker now, competing with the growing light. Soon it would become invisible entirely, its purpose fulfilled for another night. Thomas sipped his coffee and watched, waiting for the moment when he would need to climb the stairs once more and extinguish the lamp. The timing was important. The lamp should burn until natural light was sufficient for navigation, but it shouldn't burn unnecessarily into full daylight. Thomas had learned over the years to judge this moment precisely, to sense when the balance had shifted from night to day. Not yet, though. The darkness still held enough sway that the light was needed. Thomas drank his coffee slowly, savoring both the drink and the quiet. These moments before dawn had a quality unlike any other time of day, a stillness, a sense of potential, as if the world were being created anew each morning. He thought about the day ahead. After extinguishing the lamp, he would eat breakfast, oatmeal probably with some of the dried fruit he kept stored. Then the morning maintenance tasks, trimming the lamp's wick, cleaning the glass chimney thoroughly, checking all the equipment, recording observations in the official log. Later in the morning, he would need to pump fresh water, tend to the garden, perhaps work on some minor repairs to the storage shed's door, which had been sticking. The afternoon would be quieter, time for reading, for carving, for simply being. And then, as evening approached, the cycle would begin again. Every day the same, yet every day different. The weather changed, the sea changed, the light changed. Thomas's tasks remained constant, but the context in which he performed them was endlessly variable. The sky continued to lighten. The deep blue-gray was becoming paler, taking on hints of pink and orange near the horizon. The clouds Thomas had glimpsed the night before were now clearly visible, high cirrus clouds that caught the approaching sun and glowed with reflected light. Thomas finished his coffee and set the cup aside. He checked his watch, 5:45. The sun would rise in approximately 20 minutes. Time to prepare for the final task of the night watch. He pulled on his canvas work jacket. The morning air would be cold in the lantern room, and began climbing the stairs. His body protested more now than it had during the night checks. Something about the early morning made his joints stiffer, his muscles more reluctant. But he climbed steadily, counting steps out of habit, hand on the central post. The lantern room was noticeably cooler than it had been during the midnight check. The lamp had been burning for nearly 12 hours now, but the pre-dawn cold was sufficient to overcome the heat it produced. Thomas's breath formed clouds in the air as he approached the lamp. He checked the fuel level first, very low now, but still sufficient. The wick had burned down slightly and showed more carbon buildup. The glass chimney was hazed and would need thorough cleaning. But everything was still functioning, the light still shining, the lens still rotating faithfully. Thomas moved to the windows and looked out at the approaching dawn. The eastern sky was now brilliant with color, deep orange near the horizon, shading to pink, to pale blue, to the darker blue that still held overhead. The clouds were aflame with reflected light, each one outlined in gold and crimson. The sea had taken on color as well, no longer the silver-black of night, but a deep blue-gray that would lighten to blue-green as the sun rose. The waves caught the sky's colors and reflected them, creating a constantly shifting pattern of light and shadow. Thomas watched for several minutes, simply appreciating the beauty of it. Sunrise and sunset, he'd witnessed thousands of each, tens of thousands perhaps, and yet they never became mundane. Each one was unique, each one spectacular in its own way. The horizon brightened further. Any moment now the sun would appear, first as a sliver of brilliant light, then as a half circle, then as a full disk rising from the sea. Thomas waited, watching, his hand resting on the lamp's control mechanism, ready to extinguish it at the proper moment. There, the first gleam of sunlight, a point of brilliance that seemed to pierce the horizon. Thomas blinked against its intensity, his eyes having adjusted to darkness and now confronted with the sun's direct light. The gleam spread, became a curve, became a semicircle of fire rising from the water. Thomas turned the lamp's control, reducing the kerosene flow. The flame diminished, shrinking from a robust blaze to a small flicker. He waited a moment more. The sun was half visible now, casting enough light that the lighthouse beam was no longer necessary. He turned the control fully, shutting off the kerosene supply completely. The flame guttered, wavered, and went out. A thin trail of smoke rose from the wick, carrying the sharp smell of extinguished lamp. The lens, no longer illuminated from within, caught the sunrise and broke it into rainbows that danced across the lantern room walls. Thomas checked his watch and noted the time, 5:58 a.m. He would record this in the official log, lamp extinguished at 5:58 a.m., October 18th. Total burn time, 11 hours and 44 minutes. The night watch was complete. The light had served its purpose, had kept its vigil, had guided whatever ships needed guiding through the hours of darkness. Now the sun would take over, providing natural light for the day ahead. Thomas opened the access panel and examined the wick. As he'd expected, it needed trimming. A significant amount of carbon had built up on the tip. He would let the lamp cool for an hour or so, then perform the maintenance properly. He engaged the brake on the rotation mechanism, stopping the lens's movement. Without the lamp lit, there was no need for it to continue turning. The sudden stillness was almost jarring after the constant motion of the night. The sun was fully visible now, a complete disk hanging just above the horizon, too bright to look at directly. Its light spread across the water, creating a path of gold that led from the horizon directly to the base of the lighthouse. Thomas had heard this called the Golden Road, or Sun Ladder, and the name felt appropriate. It looked like a path one could walk, leading out across the waves to the edge of the world. The lantern room filled with sunlight, warm and bright after the long night. Thomas moved around the space, closing the vents he'd opened the evening before. The lamp would cool more quickly this way, and once it was cold, he would clean it thoroughly. He took one last look around, confirming that everything was secure, that no tools or supplies had been left out, that the space was orderly and ready for the next evening's lighting. Satisfied, he descended the stairs. At the bottom, Thomas paused and looked up through the center of the spiral staircase. Sunlight filtered down from above, illuminating the iron steps and stone walls. Where last night there had been the warm glow of lamplight, now there was the brilliant clarity of morning. He moved to his table and retrieved the official logbook, a large, bound volume with heavy pages designed to last for years. He opened it to the current page and began recording the night's information in his precise, careful handwriting. October 17th to 18th, 1973 lamp lit. 6:14 p.m. lamp extinguished. 5:58 a.m. total burn time. 11 hours 44 minutes weather. Clear throughout night. Wind light and variable. Sea calm. Visibility, excellent. Estimated 20+ miles vessels observed. 2 equipment status. All systems functioning normally. Fuel consumption. Within normal parameters. Maintenance performed. Routine checks at 8 p.m., 12:15 a.m., 4 a.m. He signed the entry, T. Weatherby Keeper, and closed the logbook. This log would eventually join all the others in the Lighthouse Service archives, a permanent record of this night's watch, one small piece in the vast documentation of maritime safety. With the official log completed, Thomas turned his attention to the morning routine that followed every night watch. First, breakfast. His stomach was making itself known, reminding him that he'd eaten nothing since his simple evening meal nearly 12 hours ago. He moved to the shelf where he kept his food supplies and selected a tin of oatmeal. Oatmeal was his standard breakfast, simple, nourishing, easy to prepare, and stored well. He measured out a portion into a small pot, added water from the bucket, and set it on the camping stove to cook. While the oatmeal heated, Thomas cut a thick slice from a loaf of bread he'd baked 3 days ago. The bread was still good, though beginning to dry slightly. He would finish this loaf today and tomorrow, then bake fresh bread the following day. Bread baking was another rhythm in his life, another cycle that marked time's passage. He stirred the oatmeal as it began to bubble, ensuring it didn't stick to the bottom of the pot. When it reached the right consistency, thick but not gluey, smooth but still with some texture, he removed it from the heat and spooned it into a bowl. From a jar on the shelf, he added a spoonful of honey, watching it drizzle golden over the pale oats. The honey was local, purchased from a beekeeper in Harborside during his last supply trip. It had a rich, complex flavor, wildflower honey, the beekeeper had called it, made from whatever blooms the bees could find along this stretch of coast. Thomas carried his bowl to the table, along with the slice of bread and a fresh cup of coffee. He sat and ate slowly, methodically, chewing each bite thoroughly. Eating, like everything else, deserved proper attention. The oatmeal was warm and comforting, the honey adding sweetness that complemented the grain's earthy flavor. The bread was good despite its age, substantial and satisfying. The coffee washed it all down, providing warmth and the gentle stimulation of caffeine. As he ate, Thomas looked out the window at the morning. The sun had climbed higher, its light now falling across the lighthouse grounds at a sharp angle. Everything looked fresh and new in the morning light. The grass sparkled with dew, the white paint of the tower gleamed, even the weathered wood of the storage shed seemed somehow brighter. A pair of gulls circled overhead, their cries carrying clearly in the morning air. Thomas watched them wheel and dive, their movements effortless and graceful. He recognized one of them, the larger bird with a slight irregularity in its left wing, a bend that suggested an old injury healed, but not quite perfect. He'd been seeing this gull for months now, watching it navigate the air despite its imperfection. There was something admirable in that, something that resonated with Thomas. The gull didn't let its injury stop it from flying, from living its life. It had adapted, compensated, continued. Much like Thomas himself had learned to compensate for aging knees and stiffening joints, continuing his work despite the body's gradual decline. He finished his breakfast and carried his dishes to the basin. After washing and drying them, he returned them to their places on the shelf. Everything clean, everything ordered, ready for the next use. Now came the morning maintenance. Thomas pulled on his work jacket once more and climbed the stairs, his fifth ascent since yesterday afternoon. His legs felt the accumulated strain, but he pushed through it. The work needed doing, and physical discomfort was simply part of the job. In the lantern room, the lamp had cooled sufficiently to work on. Thomas opened the access panel and carefully removed the wick. It was blackened and crusty at the tip, exactly as he'd expected. He carried it to the small workbench he kept in one corner of the lantern room, just a wooden board mounted on brackets, but sufficient for his needs. From a drawer beneath the bench, he retrieved his wick trimming scissors, a specialized tool with flat, wide blades designed for this exact purpose. He measured carefully. The wick needed to be trimmed back to clean fibers, but not so much that it became too short, and made a clean, level cut. The trimmed portion of wick went into a small metal container he kept for this purpose. When the container was full, he would dispose of the contents safely. Nothing in the lantern room was left to chance, no potential fire hazard ignored. Thomas examined the trimmed wick carefully, ensuring the cut was even, that no frayed fibers remained. Satisfied, he returned it to the lamp and secured it in place. Tonight, when he lit it again, it would burn clean and bright, no carbon buildup to diminish the flame. Next, the glass chimney. Thomas removed it from the lamp. It was heavy, awkward to handle, but he'd done this thousands of times and his movements were sure and confident. He carried it to the workbench and examined it closely. The interior was coated with a thin layer of carbon and haze, exactly as expected after a full night's burning. Thomas retrieved his cleaning supplies, special solution and soft cloths kept specifically for this purpose, and began to clean. The work was delicate. The glass was sturdy but could crack if handled roughly or if temperature changes were too abrupt. Thomas worked patiently, wiping away the carbon layer, revealing the clear glass beneath. He worked methodically, section by section, ensuring every bit of haze was removed. When the interior was clean, he turned his attention to the exterior, which had accumulated dust and the faint residue of salt spray. This cleaned more easily, requiring less effort, but he gave it the same careful attention. The chimney needed to be perfectly transparent, both inside and out, to allow the maximum light to pass through. Finished, he held the chimney up to the window, examining it against the morning light. Perfect. Completely clear, completely clean. He returned it to the lamp and secured it in place. Now the lens itself. Thomas had polished it yesterday evening, but he needed to check it again, to ensure no salt spray or dust had accumulated overnight. He moved slowly around the great lens, examining each panel, each prismatic element. A few small spots of salt spray on the seaward side, nothing major, but they needed to be addressed. Thomas dampened a cloth with his special cleaning solution and gently removed the spots. The glass became flawless, invisible, perfect. He checked the rotation mechanism, examining the gears and bearings. Everything appeared well lubricated and functioning smoothly. The weight had descended nearly to the bottom of its shaft. He wouldn't need to rewind it until this evening, but he made a mental note of it. Finally, Thomas checked the fuel reservoir. Nearly empty now, as expected. He would refill it this evening before lighting the lamp. For now, he simply made note of it in his mental checklist. The maintenance complete, Thomas stood back and surveyed the lantern room. Everything was in order, everything ready for another night's service. This was the satisfaction of routine, not the excitement of novelty, but the deep contentment of work done properly, of responsibilities fulfilled. He descended the stairs for what he hoped would be the last time this morning. Down, 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 his hand on the central post, his feet finding each familiar step. At the bottom, he paused to catch his breath and stretch his back. The morning was advancing. Thomas checked his watch, 8:30. Time for the next task on his list, pumping fresh water. He stepped outside into the bright morning. The sun was well above the horizon now, the dew already evaporating from the grass. The air was cool but pleasant, carrying the scent of the sea and the faint smell of seaweed exposed by the outgoing tide. Thomas walked to the hand pump near the storage shed. He set a large bucket beneath the spout, grasped the handle, and began to pump. The mechanism squeaked and groaned in its familiar way. He really should oil it, but somehow he never got around to it. The squeak was distinctive, almost friendly, a sound so much a part of this place that its absence would feel wrong. Water began to flow, cold and clear. Thomas pumped steadily, rhythmically, feeling the resistance as the pump drew water up from deep in the earth. The bucket filled slowly, the water level rising. When it was full, Thomas stopped pumping and carefully carried the bucket back to the lighthouse. Inside, he poured the fresh water into his storage bucket, replacing what he'd used for tea and coffee and washing. He made a second trip to the pump, filling another bucket that he would use for the day's cooking and drinking. Fresh water every morning, another part of the routine, another small but essential task. With the water taken care of, Thomas turned his attention to the garden. He walked to the small plot beside the storage shed and surveyed his plants. The tomatoes, as he'd noted yesterday, were nearly finished. A dozen fruit remained on the vines, most of them small but a few of reasonable size. Thomas began picking, moving carefully among the plants, selecting only the tomatoes that were fully ripe or close to it. The green ones he left. They might ripen further in the next few days, or they might not, but there was no point harvesting them prematurely. The ripe tomatoes went into a basket he'd brought from the lighthouse. When he finished picking, he had perhaps 8 good-sized tomatoes and 4 smaller ones. Not a large harvest, but respectable for this late in the season. He carried the basket back inside and set it on his table. Tomorrow, or perhaps the day after, he would make sauce from these tomatoes, cooking them down with herbs and salt, preserving them in jars for the winter months ahead. Nothing complicated, simple tomato sauce was all he needed, something to add flavor and nutrition to his meals during the cold months when the garden lay dormant. With the tomatoes harvested and the morning's essential tasks completed, Thomas found himself with several hours of unstructured time. This was the gift of the lighthouse keeper's schedule. The early mornings and late evenings were rigorously structured around the needs of the light, but the middle portions of the day allowed for flexibility, for attending to the 100 small tasks that kept the station running, or simply for rest and quiet occupation. He decided to address the storage shed door, which had been sticking for the past week. It was a minor issue, but minor issues had a way of becoming major problems if left unattended. Thomas had learned long ago that preventive maintenance was the cornerstone of reliable operation, whether for a lighthouse lens or a simple door. From his small tool collection, Thomas gathered what he needed: a plane for shaving wood, sandpaper, a screwdriver, and a small can of oil. He carried these outside to the shed, enjoying the warmth of the sun on his face. The morning had turned genuinely pleasant, the temperature climbing into the low 60s, the breeze gentle and steady from the southwest. Thomas examined the door carefully, opening and closing it several times, observing where it caught and dragged. The problem was at the top hinge side. The door had swollen slightly from moisture, and the wood was rubbing against the frame. Common problem in coastal buildings, where salt, air, and humidity were constant factors. He removed the door from its hinges. It was lighter than it looked, made of pine boards that had dried and lightened over decades. He set it across 2 sawhorses he kept in the shed for exactly this purpose, creating a makeshift workbench. The plane was old, inherited from Samuel Morrison, who'd inherited it from the keeper before him. The tool had been sharpening and maintaining lighthouse station buildings for perhaps 70 years. The wooden body was smooth and dark from handling, the blade still sharp because Thomas kept it that way. He adjusted the plane's depth, taking a few test strokes on a scrap piece of wood to ensure it was set correctly. Too shallow, and it would take forever to remove enough material. Too deep, and he might take off too much, creating gaps that would let in weather. Just right, the plane should remove thin, curling shavings with each stroke. Thomas positioned the door and began to work, pushing the plane along the edge that had been sticking. The tool made a satisfying sound, a whisper of blade against wood, and left behind smooth wood surface. Thin curls of pine peeled away from the edge, falling to the ground in pale spirals. The work was meditative, requiring attention but not intense concentration. Push, lift, reposition. Push, lift, reposition. The rhythm was soothing, the gradual transformation of rough to smooth satisfying in a fundamental way. As he worked, Thomas thought about the nature of maintenance, of the constant attention required to keep things functioning properly. The lighthouse, the station, the equipment, all of it required endless small interventions, countless minor repairs and adjustments. Nothing could be allowed to simply exist without care. Everything needed tending. In a way, Thomas thought, he was as much a tender of things as a keeper of light. He tended the lens, the lamp, the rotation mechanism. He tended the building itself, the grounds, the equipment. He tended his own body, ensuring it remained capable of performing the necessary work. All of it was of a piece, all of it part of the same fundamental task, maintaining order against entropy's constant pressure. The edge of the door was becoming noticeably thinner, the swollen portion gradually planed away. Thomas paused periodically to test fit the door against the frame, ensuring he wasn't removing too much material. The fit needed to be close but not tight, allowing for future swelling without binding. After perhaps 20 minutes of work, the door fit properly. Thomas opened and closed it several times, feeling for any remaining drag or catch. Smooth. Perfect. He hung it back on its hinges and tested it again. The door swung freely, closing completely without binding. He oiled the hinges for good measure, working the oil into the pins and joints until they moved silently. Then he stood back and admired his work. A small thing, a trivial thing really, but done properly. That mattered. Thomas gathered his tools and returned them to their places inside the lighthouse. He glanced at the clock, 10:15. The morning was advancing steadily toward noon. His stomach suggested that lunch would be welcome before long, but he wasn't quite hungry yet. He decided to walk down to the beach. The tide should be near low now, and low tide was the best time for beachcombing, for seeing what the ocean had brought in during the night. The path down to the beach was easier in daylight than it had been yesterday evening. Thomas descended carefully, his boots finding secure footing on the rocky sections, his hand occasionally reaching out to steady himself against larger boulders. His knees complained slightly, but he ignored them. The walk was good for him, kept him mobile and strong. At the bottom, the beach spread before him, a tumbled expanse of rocks and stones interspersed with small patches of coarse sand. The tide had retreated, exposing tidal-pools and wide stretches of dark, wet stone decorated with barnacles and seaweed. Thomas walked slowly along the tidal-line, his eyes scanning the debris left by the retreating water. Seaweed and thick, tangled ropes. Pieces of driftwood in various sizes and states of decay. Shells, mostly periwinkles and mussels, but occasionally something more interesting. Small fragments of fishing gear, buoys, rope, net scraps. He found a sand dollar, intact and perfect, bleached white by the sun. These were uncommon on this beach, and Thomas picked it up carefully, examining it. The intricate pattern of holes on its surface was delicate, beautiful in its symmetry. He turned it over, looking at the other side, equally perfect. A small treasure. Thomas slipped the sand dollar into his jacket pocket, intending to add it to the small collection of beach finds he kept on a shelf in the lighthouse. He continued walking, following the curve of the beach. A piece of blue-green glass caught his eye, smooth and frosted by years in the sea. Sea glass was always a pleasant find. Glass that had begun as someone's bottle or jar, broken and discarded, then tumbled by waves and sand until it became something new, something beautiful in its own right. He picked up the glass and held it up to the light. It glowed, translucent, the color of the sea itself. Another pocket treasure. Thomas continued his walk, not looking for anything in particular but simply observing, being present with the beach and the water and the morning. A cluster of mussels clung to a rock, their shells a deep blue-black, wet and shining. A crab scuttled between stones, disappearing into a crevice when Thomas's shadow fell across it. The waves rolled in steadily, smaller now at low tide but still persistent, still following their eternal pattern. Thomas stood and watched them for several minutes, feeling their rhythm, feeling the patience of water slowly reshaping stone. This was the sea's true power, he thought. Not the dramatic power of storms, though those were impressive and dangerous, but the quiet, persistent power of ordinary waves, day after day, year after year, century after century, gradually wearing away the land, changing the shape of the coast, moving stones and sand grain by grain. The lighthouse stood against that power, a statement of human persistence matching nature's own. The sea worked to erode the coast, and humans built structures to withstand that erosion, to mark it, to warn of it. An old contest, ongoing with no clear winner. Thomas turned and began the climb back up to the lighthouse. The ascent was harder than the descent, as always, and he paused twice to rest. But the exertion felt good, felt like proof that his body still functioned, still served him adequately despite its age. Back at the top of the path, slightly winded but satisfied, Thomas looked back down at the beach and the sea beyond. The sun was high enough now that the water had taken on its daytime blue-green color, bright and clear. A beautiful day, mild and peaceful. He returned to the lighthouse and checked the clock. 11:30. Definitely time for lunch. He prepared a simple meal, a can of soup heated on the stove, some of the bread with cheese, an apple from his small store of fruit. Nothing elaborate, but satisfying. He ate at his table, looking out the window at the grounds, at the sea beyond. After lunch, he washed his dishes and put them away. Then he stood for a moment, considering how to spend the afternoon. The partially carved driftwood on the shelf caught his eye. Yes, he would work on that. Continue shaping the gull, see if he could capture the essence of flight in the wood's curves. Thomas retrieved his carving tools and the driftwood, settled into his chair, and began to work. The knife moved carefully through the wood, each cut deliberate and considered. The gull was emerging slowly from the shapeless driftwood, becoming more defined with each session of work. Outside, the afternoon unfolded in its quiet way. The sun climbed toward its peak, then began its slow descent toward evening. The wind continued its gentle blowing. The waves continued their patient rolling against the shore. Inside the lighthouse, Thomas carved, his hands moving with the practiced skill of years, his mind quiet and content. Time passed, measured not in minutes but in small curls of wood falling to the table, in the gradual refinement of form. This was enough. This was everything. The light would need tending again when evening came, and Thomas would tend it. But for now, in this peaceful afternoon, there was simply this: the work of his hands, the quiet of the lighthouse, the eternal presence of the sea. Thomas worked on the carving for over an hour, his attention focused on the emerging form of the gull. The head was taking shape now, the beak becoming more defined, the suggestion of an eye forming where wood met shadow. The wings, those were the challenge. He wanted to capture not just their shape but their tension, the way a gull's wings looked when fully extended, riding the wind. He set down his knife periodically to examine the work from different angles, turning the driftwood in his hands, considering what to remove next, what to leave. The wood had its own ideas about form, its grain suggesting certain directions, certain shapes. Thomas had learned to work with the wood rather than against it, to find the balance between his vision and the material's nature. By 1:30, his hands were beginning to cramp slightly, and his eyes felt strained from close work. Thomas set the carving aside, flexing his fingers, rolling his shoulders. Enough for now. The gull would be there tomorrow, and the next day, and all the days it took to complete it properly. There was no rush. He stood and stretched, feeling his spine crack slightly. His body was reminding him that sitting hunched over carving for an extended period wasn't ideal for a 73-year-old frame. But the work had been satisfying, and the slight discomfort was a fair price. Thomas moved to the window and looked out. The afternoon was well established now, the sun past its zenith and beginning its leisurely arc toward evening. The quality of light had shifted, becoming warmer, softer. In another few hours, it would be time to begin the evening ritual again, cleaning the lens, lighting the lamp, maintaining the watch. But for now, the afternoon stretched ahead, unhurried. Thomas decided a walk around the grounds was in order, both to loosen his stiff muscles and to check on various elements of the station. He pulled on his canvas jacket and stepped outside. The temperature had climbed into the mid-60s, pleasant for October. Thomas walked slowly around the perimeter of the lighthouse, his eyes noting details with the practiced attention of long experience. The grass was holding up well despite the cooler nights. The flagpole stood straight and secure. The weather vane turned smoothly, pointing southwest now, indicating a shift in wind direction. He walked to the edge of the property, where the land began its steep descent toward the beach. From here, the view was expansive, miles of coastline visible to the north and south, the sea stretching endlessly to the east. A fishing boat was visible far offshore, probably working lobster traps. Closer in, a few gulls circled and dove, hunting for fish near the surface. Thomas stood and simply observed, breathing the salt air, feeling the wind on his face. These moments of stillness, of simply being present without task or purpose, were rare for him. His life was so structured around duty that moments without duty felt almost strange, slightly disorienting. But they were necessary too, he recognized. A person couldn't be all duty, all purpose, all the time. There needed to be spaces for simply existing, for appreciating, for being rather than doing. Thomas had learned this slowly over the years, had gradually allowed himself these small pockets of aimlessness. He turned and walked back toward the lighthouse, following a slightly different route that took him past the old foundation stones of a building long gone. The stones were barely visible now, mostly overgrown with grass and moss, but Thomas knew where they were. Samuel Morrison had told him about the old keeper's cottage that once stood here, destroyed in a storm sometime in the 1890s. After that, keepers had lived in the lighthouse itself, as Thomas did now. Sometimes Thomas wondered about those earlier keepers, the men who'd tended this light before him. What had their lives been like? What had they thought about during their long night watches? What had driven them to this solitary work? The lighthouse service kept records, of course. Thomas knew the names of every keeper who'd served at Beacon Point, knew the basic facts of their tenures. But the personal details, the inner lives, those were lost. Each keeper had kept his private thoughts private, had carried his experiences alone, and when each one left or died, that knowledge disappeared with him. Would anyone remember Thomas after he was gone? Would anyone know what it had been like to be here, to tend this light, to live this particular life? Probably not. He would become just another name in the records, another keeper in the long succession of keepers, notable only for having served a long time. That should have bothered him, perhaps, but it didn't. Thomas had never sought recognition or remembrance. The work itself was enough. The light shone, ships were guided safely, the duty was fulfilled. That was what mattered, not whether anyone remembered the man who'd done it. He reached the lighthouse and ran his hand along the white-painted stone of the wall. The wall was solid, enduring, built to last centuries. The light would continue long after Thomas was gone. Other keepers would climb these stairs, tend this lens, fulfill this duty. The work was larger than any individual keeper, connected to something fundamental about human nature, the need to help, to guide, to keep faith with those who depended on you. Thomas walked around to the front entrance and went inside. The interior felt cool after the warmth of the afternoon sun. He removed his jacket and hung it on its peg, then moved to his water bucket and dipped a cup, drinking deeply. The clock on the shelf showed 2:30. Still several hours until he needed to begin the evening preparations. Thomas considered his options. He could read, though his eyes were still slightly tired from carving. He could write in his journal, though he had nothing particular to record. He could do some minor cleaning or organizing, though everything was already quite clean and organized. In the end, he decided on something he did perhaps once or twice a week. He would allow himself an afternoon rest, a brief nap to refresh himself before the evening's work. This felt slightly indulgent. Thomas's work ethic generally resisted rest during daylight hours, but he'd learned to override that resistance. Rest wasn't laziness, it was maintenance, keeping himself fit for the work ahead. He moved to his bed and lay down on top of the blanket, his hands folded on his chest, his eyes closing. The lighthouse was quiet around him. The sound of the waves was a distant whisper. The wind made soft sounds as it moved around the tower. Thomas's breathing slowed, deepened. His body relaxed, releasing the accumulated tension of the day's activities. His mind drifted, not quite sleeping but not fully awake either, in that pleasant state between consciousness and dreams. Images moved through his mind, disconnected and fluid. The gleam of sunlight on the lens, the curve of a gull's wing, the pattern of waves on the beach. His father's face, younger than Thomas, was now smiling. The blue teapot on the stove, the spiral of the stairs reaching upward. Time passed unmeasured. Thomas floated in that quiet space, suspended at rest. When he woke, it was with the same sudden alertness that characterized his nighttime wakings. His eyes opened, his mind immediately clear and oriented. The clock showed 4 o'clock. He'd slept for approximately 90 minutes, longer than he'd intended, but not problematically so. Thomas sat up, feeling refreshed. The brief sleep had done him good. His muscles felt looser, his mind clearer. He stood and stretched, then moved to the window. The afternoon had continued its gentle progression while he slept. The sun was noticeably lower, the light taking on that particular golden quality that preceded evening. Shadows were lengthening across the grounds. The wind had picked up slightly, rustling the grass. It would be time soon to begin the evening ritual. Not quite yet, another 30 minutes, perhaps, but soon. Thomas felt the familiar anticipation building, the mental preparation for the sequence of tasks ahead. He decided to make tea, to mark this transition point between the unstructured afternoon and the structured evening. The ritual of tea-making helped him shift mental gears, helped him move from rest mode into work mode. He filled the teapot with water, set it on the stove, selected his tea. While the water heated, he tidied the table, putting away the carving tools and the partially finished gull, clearing the surface. Everything in its place before beginning the evening work. The water boiled, and Thomas made his tea, steeping it for exactly 4 minutes. He poured a cup and carried it to the window, standing and sipping, watching the light change, watching the day begin its slow transformation into night. This was the moment he cherished most in the entire daily cycle. This cusp between day and evening, this point where his true work would begin. The morning maintenance was important, the afternoon tasks necessary, but this, the evening ritual of preparing and lighting the lamp, this was the heart of it all. Thomas finished his tea, washed the cup, and checked the clock. 4:30. Time to begin. He moved to the storage shed and gathered his supplies, just as he had done yesterday evening, and would do tomorrow evening, and the evening after that. The cleaning cloths, the polishing solution, the kerosene can. Everything ready, everything in hand. He carried them into the lighthouse and set them at the base of the stairs. Then he paused, his hand on the central post, looking upward through the spiral to the light far above. Another evening, he said quietly to the lighthouse, to himself, to no one. Another watch to keep. And he began to climb, step by step, beginning the ritual once more, fulfilling the duty that had shaped his life for 47 years, and would continue to shape it for however many evenings remained to him. The light would shine tonight. Ships would be guided. The promise would be kept. This was enough. This was everything. Thomas climbed the spiral stairs with his supplies, his movements automatic after decades of repetition. 147 steps, each one familiar as his own heartbeat. At the 70th step, he paused at the window that faced northeast, as he always did, and looked out at the town of Harborside in the distance. Smoke rose from more chimneys now than there had been this morning. People returning home from work, preparing evening meals, settling into their domestic routines. Thomas wondered sometimes what those lives were like, filled with family and neighbors and constant human contact. He'd chosen a different path, but that didn't mean he never wondered about the road not taken. He continued climbing. At the landing, he shifted the kerosene can to his other hand, giving his right arm a rest. The can wasn't particularly heavy, but the accumulated effort of carrying it up all these stairs made itself felt. Everything made itself felt more at 73 than it had at 50, or 30, or 26. Finally, the top. Thomas emerged into the lantern room and set down his supplies. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, filling the space with warm, amber light. The lens stood waiting, patient and magnificent, ready for another night's service. Thomas began with his inspection, walking slowly around the lens, checking for any issues that might have developed during the day. Unlikely, the lens was well protected and rarely developed problems between evening cleanings, but the check was part of the ritual, a gesture of care and attention that mattered regardless of practical necessity. Everything looked perfect. The glass was still clean from his morning maintenance, showing no new accumulation of salt or dust. The rotation mechanism sat still and silent, waiting to be engaged. The lamp itself stood ready, its wick trimmed fresh this morning, its glass chimney spotless. Still, Thomas would polish the lens. This was non-negotiable, as fundamental to Lighthouse keeping his breathing was to living. Even if the lens appeared perfectly clean, even if no visible residue marked its surface, he would polish it. The ritual demanded it, and more importantly, the ships at sea deserved it. He opened the vents around the lantern room, allowing fresh air to flow through. The breeze had picked up as afternoon moved toward evening, and it carried the sharp, clean smell of the ocean. Thomas breathed it in, feeling it fill his lungs, feeling it wake something alert and vital in him. He dampened his cleaning cloth with polish and began to work, starting at the top of the lens as always, moving in careful circular motions. The cloth whispered against the glass, removing imperceptible traces of dust, leaving behind perfect transparency. As he worked, Thomas's mind wandered to a conversation he'd had years ago with Samuel Morrison, back when Thomas was newly assigned to Beacon Point. They'd been standing in this very room, and Samuel had been teaching him the proper way to polish the lens. "You'll do this thousands of times," Samuel had said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "And every single time, you'll do it the same way. Start at the top, work your way down. Circular motions, gentle but thorough. Never rush, never skip sections, never convince yourself it's good enough when it could be better." "What if I get tired of it?" Thomas had asked. He'd been young then, hadn't yet understood the power of routine, the satisfaction of perfect repetition. Samuel had smiled slightly. "Then you're in the wrong profession, son. A lighthouse keeper's not looking for variety. He's looking for the opposite of variety. He's looking for absolute consistency, for the ability to do the same task the same way every single time, world without end. If that doesn't appeal to you, if that sounds like a prison sentence, then you should leave now before you've invested too much. But it had appealed to Thomas. Even then, even as a young man still figuring out who he was and what he wanted, he'd felt the rightness of it. The idea of a life built around routine, around reliable repetition, around being a human constant in an inconstant world, that had resonated with something deep in his character. And so he'd stayed. Samuel had left after those 2 weeks of training, transferred to a lighthouse farther north for his final years of service before retirement. Thomas had written to him a few times, letters describing his first months at Beacon Point, asking questions about equipment or procedures. Samuel had written back, his responses brief but helpful, the words of a man who understood exactly what Thomas was experiencing. Then one winter, about 5 years after Thomas had arrived at Beacon Point, a letter had come from Samuel's daughter. Samuel had died peacefully in his sleep. The funeral had already happened. By the time the letter reached Thomas at his remote post, Samuel had been in the ground for weeks. Thomas had stood at this very window, letter in hand, looking out at the gray winter sea, feeling a profound sense of loss. Samuel had been more than a trainer. He'd been a connection to the long tradition of lighthouse keeping, a link to all the keepers who'd come before. And now he was gone, and Thomas stood alone in that chain, neither the beginning nor the end, but somewhere in the middle, carrying forward what had been passed to him. He finished polishing the top sections of the lens and moved to the middle rings. His hands moved automatically, following patterns so deeply ingrained they required no conscious thought. The cloth traced circles, the glass gleamed, the afternoon light danced through the prisms and created rainbows that played across the walls. Through the windows, Thomas could see the sun sinking lower. Perhaps an hour until sunset now, perhaps a bit more. The sky was clear, promising another spectacular evening. The sea was calm, its surface catching the golden light and throwing it back in glittering patterns. A ship was visible on the horizon, a large vessel, probably a container ship heading south along the coast toward Boston or New York. Thomas paused in his polishing to watch it for a moment. Even from this distance, even as just a dark shape on the bright water, it represented human endeavor, people at work, lives being lived. That ship would see his light tonight. Its crew might not consciously register it. Modern ships had so many electronic navigation aids that lighthouses were almost redundant. But the light would be there nonetheless, a backup, a confirmation, a connection to centuries of maritime tradition. Thomas returned to his polishing. The middle sections of the lens were done now, and he moved to the lower portions. These were often the dirtiest, catching spray and dust that the upper sections missed, but tonight they were relatively clean. Still, he gave them the same thorough attention, the same careful circular motions, the same refusal to accept merely adequate when perfect was possible. His back was beginning to ache from bending over, and his knees complained about the crouching position required to reach the lowest sections. Thomas ignored the discomfort. Pain was temporary and mostly insignificant. The lens was permanent and entirely significant. As he worked, he thought about the nature of care, of attention, of the way small actions accumulated into something larger. Each time he polished the lens, each time he cleaned the windows, each time he trimmed the wick or checked the fuel. These were small acts, individually almost meaningless. But taken together, repeated night after night, year after year, they became something significant. They became reliability. They became trust. They became a promise kept to every sailor who ventured onto these waters. The windows finished, Thomas checked his supplies. He had everything he needed for lighting the lamp. The kerosene can, matches, his steady hands, his practiced movements. Everything was ready. He was ready, but not quite time yet. The sun was still above the horizon, its light still sufficient for navigation. Thomas would wait, as he always did, for that precise moment when natural light failed and artificial light became necessary. That moment was different every day, shifting with the seasons, affected by weather and atmospheric conditions. But Thomas knew how to sense it, had developed an instinct for it over decades of practice. He moved to the western windows and stood watching the sunset develop. The sky was becoming more colorful now, the clear air allowing the sun's light to paint elaborate displays across the horizon. Gold near the sun itself, shading to orange, to pink, to a pale purple that deepened toward blue overhead. The sun continued its descent, and Thomas stood witness, as he had stood witness to thousands of sunsets before this one. Each was unique, each was beautiful, each marked the transition from day to night, from the sun's dominion to the lighthouse's duty. The clouds that had been high and thin this morning had thickened slightly, forming layered formations in the western sky. They caught the sun's light and held it, glowing with internal fire, deep orange and crimson and gold, colors so vivid they seemed almost unreal. Thomas had read somewhere years ago that sunset colors were caused by the scattering of light through the atmosphere, that the reds and oranges were simply wavelengths that could penetrate the greatest distance through air. The explanation made scientific sense, but it didn't diminish the beauty. Understanding the mechanism didn't reduce the wonder. The ocean reflected the sky's colors, becoming a vast mirror of fire and gold. The gentle swells caught the light on their crests, each one briefly brilliant before falling back into shadow. The fishing boat Thomas had seen earlier was closer now, heading toward Harborside Harbor, its white hull turned golden by the evening light. Thomas checked his watch. 5:50. The sun was perhaps 10 minutes from touching the horizon. Time to prepare the lamp for lighting. He turned from the window and moved to the lamp itself. First, the fuel check. He unscrewed the reservoir and examined the level. Empty, as expected after last night's burning. Thomas picked up the kerosene can and carefully poured fuel into the reservoir, watching the level rise, stopping precisely at the indicator line. The kerosene smell was strong in the enclosed space, sharp and chemical. Thomas had long ago stopped noticing it consciously, but it registered somewhere in his awareness, a scent deeply associated with his work, with his purpose. He replaced the reservoir cap and checked the wick. Still clean from this morning's trimming, exactly as it should be. He tested the wick adjustment mechanism, raising and lowering it slightly to ensure it moved freely. Everything functioning perfectly. Next, the rotation mechanism. Thomas moved to the winding point and fitted the crank into its socket. He began to turn, counting as he always did. The mechanism clicked with each rotation, the sound echoing slightly in the stone chamber. Thomas counted 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. 63. Complete. He removed the crank and hung it on its hook, then checked the weight. It hung at the top of its travel, ready to descend slowly through the night, powering the rotation of the lens. Everything ready. Everything in order. Thomas returned to the western windows. The sun was touching the horizon now, its lower edge seeming to melt into the sea. The colors had intensified, the sky ablaze with crimson and gold and orange. The light had taken on that particular quality of late sunset, clear and sharp and somehow poignant, as if the day were making its final statement before surrendering to night. He watched as the sun sank lower. Half visible now, then just a quarter, then a bright sliver that hurt to look at directly. And then it was gone, slipped beneath the edge of the world, leaving only its glow in the sky. The moment had come. Thomas moved to the lamp with deliberate care. From the small waterproof container, he selected a single match. He closed the container and struck the match against the striker mounted on the wall. The match flared, bright and sudden in the dimming light of the lantern room. Thomas held the match steady, letting the flame strengthen, ensuring it was burning reliably. Then he lowered it carefully to the lamp's wick. The wick caught immediately, flame spreading across its width, and Thomas adjusted the fuel flow until the flame burned bright and steady and clean. He replaced the glass chimney, enclosing the flame, protecting it from drafts. The flame strengthened, burning clear yellow with hints of blue at the base, exactly as it should. The heat began to rise, warming the glass, preparing the lens for its work. Thomas engaged the rotation mechanism. The lens began to turn, smoothly and steadily, one complete revolution every 15 seconds. As it turned, it gathered the lamp's light and focused it, magnified it, transformed it into a powerful beam that swept around the horizon. The beam was faint at first, barely visible in the remaining daylight. But as Thomas watched, as the sky continued to darken, the beam became more prominent, more powerful. Within minutes, it was clearly visible, a brilliant shaft of light sweeping across the darkening sky. Thomas checked his watch and noted the time, 6:07 p.m. He would record this later in the official log. The light was lit. The watch had begun. He stood for a moment, simply observing, confirming that everything was functioning correctly. The flame burned steadily, the lens rotated smoothly, the beam swept around with perfect regularity. Flash. 15 seconds. Flash. 15 seconds. Flash. All was as it should be. Thomas descended the stairs, leaving the light to its work. Down, down, down the spiral, his hand on the central post, his feet finding each step. At the bottom, he returned to his living quarters and moved immediately to his table. The official logbook lay waiting. Thomas opened it to a fresh page and began to write. October 18th, evening lamp lit. 6:07 p.m. weather, clear skies. Wind southwest, moderate. Sea calm with gentle swells. Visibility, excellent, estimated 20+ miles. Equipment status. All systems functioning normally, fuel loaded. Full reservoir maintenance performed. Lens polished, windows cleaned, wick inspected, rotation mechanism wound. He signed the entry and closed the logbook. The official record was complete. Now for his personal journal. Thomas opened his leather-bound journal to the current page and uncapped his fountain pen. He wrote, "Another beautiful evening. The sunset was spectacular. Layers of clouds caught the light and held it, creating colors I'm not sure I have words to describe. Crimson but deeper, gold but richer. The kind of sunset that reminds you why you're here, doing this work. The lens is clean, the lamp is burning, the watch is kept. 47 years of this, and it still feels right. Still feels necessary. Still feels like exactly what I'm meant to be doing. I found a sand dollar on the beach this morning, perfect and white. Also a piece of sea glass, blue-green like the ocean itself. Small treasures. Small reminders that the sea gives as well as takes." He paused, pen hovering over the page, then added, "Sometimes I think about what comes after. Not death necessarily, though that too, but after lighthouse keeping. After this life I've built. Will I look back and think I spent my time well? Will I have regrets? I don't think I will. This work has meaning. Maybe not grand meaning, maybe not the kind that gets remembered in history books, but real meaning nonetheless. Every night the light shines, someone somewhere is safer for it. That's enough." Thomas set down his pen and closed the journal. These philosophical musings came sometimes, usually in the evening, when the day's work was done and the night stretched ahead. They didn't trouble him exactly, but they did make him thoughtful, reflective. He rose and moved to his small kitchen area, deciding to prepare his evening meal. Tonight he would have something simple, canned stew again, perhaps, or maybe beans with bacon. Something warming and substantial to carry him through the night watches. As he worked, heating his food and preparing his meal, Thomas found himself thinking about legacy, about what would remain of him after he was gone. Not much, probably. The lighthouse would continue, but it would outlast any memory of him. His journals would be thrown away or lost, his carvings would decay or be discarded. The careful maintenance he'd performed, the countless nights he'd kept the watch, all of it would fade into the general history of the lighthouse, indistinguishable from the work of any other keeper. But perhaps that was how it should be. Perhaps the best kind of work was the kind that disappeared into function, that became invisible in its reliability. The lighthouse didn't need to remember Thomas Weatherby. It only needed to shine, night after night, as it always had. He carried his bowl of stew to the table and sat down to eat. Through the window, he could see the beam from the lighthouse sweeping past, regular as clockwork, steady as the stars. The night was fully here now, darkness complete except for that faithful, turning light. Thomas ate slowly, without hurry. After dinner, he would rest for a while, perhaps read, perhaps work on his carving. Then at 8 o'clock, the first night check. At midnight, the second. At 4 in the morning, the third. And then, as dawn approached, he would extinguish the lamp and begin another day. The routine was unchanging, had been unchanging for 47 years, would remain unchanging for however long he was able to continue it. Some people would find that monotonous, even maddening. But for Thomas, it was perfect. It was exactly right. He finished his meal and washed his dishes, returning everything to its proper place. Then he lit his oil lamp, settled into his chair, and reached for his book of poetry. Another evening unfolding in its familiar pattern, another night watch beginning. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept around and around, piercing the darkness, keeping its promise to the sea. Thomas opened the book of poetry to a new page, letting it fall where it would. The poem that appeared was one he didn't immediately recognize, The Road Not Taken, by Robert Frost. He'd read it before, certainly, but not recently enough to have it committed to memory. He read slowly, following the familiar lines about two roads diverging in a yellow wood, about the choice of paths, about the way one decision could shape an entire life. The poem ended with those famous lines about taking the road less traveled, and how that had made all the difference. Thomas closed the book and sat thinking. Had he taken the road less traveled? In some ways, yes. Lighthouse keeping was certainly not a common profession, even in his youth. Most people chose lives filled with more human contact, more variety, more of what society deemed success. But in other ways, Thomas had simply followed his nature. He hadn't chosen lighthouse keeping as an act of rebellion or adventure. He'd chosen it because it suited him, because it felt right, because when he'd first learned about the profession and what it entailed, something in him had said, "Yes, this is what I'm meant to do." Was that taking the road less traveled, or was it simply taking the road that was his to take? Thomas wasn't sure the distinction mattered. He'd made his choices, lived his life, and here he was, 73 years old, sitting in a lighthouse, keeping a watch he'd kept for 47 years. He had no regrets. That was the important thing. Whatever roads he'd taken or not taken, whatever choices he'd made or avoided, he'd ended up in a place of contentment, of purpose, of satisfaction with his days. How many people could say that? The oil lamp flickered slightly, and Thomas adjusted the wick. The flame steadied, casting its warm glow across the table and his open book. Outside, full darkness had fallen. The moon hadn't risen yet. It would come later, after 8 o'clock. For now, the stars provided the only natural light, and they were magnificent tonight. Thomas set aside his book and moved to the window. Through the glass, he could see countless stars, more than were ever visible from cities with their light pollution. The Milky Way stretched across the sky, a river of faint light that spoke of distances almost impossible to comprehend. Thomas had never been much for astronomy. He knew the basic constellations, the important stars for navigation, but he'd never studied the science in depth. Still, he appreciated the stars, appreciated the way they made him feel small and connected all at once. Small because they represented such vast scales of space and time. Connected because the same stars had shone on every human who'd ever lived, would shine on every human yet to come. The lighthouse beam swept past the window, briefly illuminating the grounds outside. In that flash of light, Thomas saw a fox moving across the grass, a red fox, probably hunting mice or voles. The fox froze when the light hit it, then bolted for the cover of the rocks when darkness returned. Thomas smiled. He didn't see the foxes often, though he knew they lived around the lighthouse, denning somewhere among the rocks or in the scrubby vegetation farther inland. They were shy creatures, mostly nocturnal, avoiding human contact. But occasionally one would appear, usually at dawn or dusk, going about its business with focused intensity. The natural world continued around the lighthouse, indifferent to Thomas's presence. The foxes hunted, the gulls nested, the seals occasionally hauled out on the rocks below. The lighthouse existed within this web of life, part of it and apart from it at the same time. Thomas returned to his chair and considered his options for the next hour before his 8 o'clock check. He could continue reading, but he wasn't quite in the mood for poetry now. He could work on his carving, but his hands were tired from the earlier session. He could write more in his journal, but he'd already recorded his thoughts for the day. Instead, he decided to simply sit, to be present, to be still, to let his mind wander where it would without directing it toward any particular task or goal. This was difficult for him. It went against his nature, against the habits of a lifetime. Thomas was a man of purpose, of task, of duty. Sitting without doing felt almost transgressive, almost wrong. But he'd been working on this, trying to allow himself moments of pure rest, of existence without production. He sat in his chair, hands folded in his lap, eyes half closed. The oil lamp burned softly. The distant sound of waves provided a gentle rhythm. The clicking of the rotation mechanism filtered down from far above, barely audible but present. Thomas's breathing slowed. His thoughts drifted, not following any particular thread, but moving from image to memory to observation to feeling. He thought about his father, dead 15 years now. He thought about the gull with the damaged wing. He thought about the texture of driftwood under his carving knife. He thought about nothing in particular. Time passed. The clock ticked. The lighthouse beam swept around and around, faithful and constant. At 7:30, Thomas stirred and checked his watch. Half an hour until the first night check. Time, perhaps, for a cup of tea to accompany him through the evening. He rose and prepared tea, going through the familiar ritual. Water in the kettle, flame on the stove, tea leaves measured. The water heated, and Thomas stood watching it, observing the small bubbles that formed at the bottom, the first wisps of steam that rose from the surface. When the water was ready, he poured it over the tea and let it steep. For minutes exactly, timed by his mechanical timer. When the tea was done, he poured a cup and carried it back to his chair. The tea was hot and strong, warming him from within. Thomas sipped it slowly, appreciating the flavor, the comfort, the simple pleasure of a good cup of tea on a quiet evening. Through the window, he noticed the first hint of light on the eastern horizon. The moon was beginning to rise. Within 20 minutes or so, it would clear the horizon completely, and its light would flood across the landscape, silvering the sea and illuminating the grounds around the lighthouse. Thomas finished his tea and checked his watch. 7:55. Time for the first check. He stood, stretched, and began the climb up the spiral stairs. His fourth ascent of the day. He'd lost count of how many times he'd climbed these stairs over the years. Hundreds of thousands, certainly. Perhaps over 1,000,000. Each climb the same, yet each somehow different. At the top, the lantern room was warm from hours of the lamps burning. Thomas went through his checklist automatically, checking fuel level, wick condition, flame quality, glass clarity, rotation mechanism function. Everything was perfect. Everything was as it should be. He moved to the windows and looked out. The moon was visible now, just clearing the horizon, huge and orange in the way moons always appeared when viewed close to the horizon. As he watched, it climbed higher, shrinking slightly, its color shifting from orange to gold to silver white. The moonlight transformed the landscape, making everything visible that had been hidden in darkness. The path down to the beach stood out clearly. The storage shed cast a sharp shadow. The waves became individual entities, each one visible as it rolled toward shore. Thomas scanned the horizon for ships. The fishing boat that had been returning to harbor earlier was long gone, safely docked. But far to the south he spotted lights, a large vessel, probably a cargo ship, heading north. He watched it for several minutes, tracking its course, confirming it was maintaining safe distance from the coast. The ship was perhaps 15 miles out, well clear of any danger. It would pass Beacon Point in the next hour or two, and its crew might glance toward shore and see the lighthouse beam sweeping across the water. Or they might not notice it at all, focused on their work, trusting in their electronic navigation systems. Either way, the light was there. That was what mattered. Satisfied with his inspection, Thomas descended the stairs once more. Back in his living quarters, he noted the time in his journal. 8 o'clock check completed, all systems normal, then settled back into his chair. The evening stretched ahead. 4 more hours until the midnight check. Time enough for reading, for quiet thought, for the slow unwinding of the day into night. Thomas picked up his poetry book again, opening it to a different page. This time a poem about the sea appeared, Sea Fever by John Masefield. He read the opening lines. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea and the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by. Thomas smiled slightly. He'd gone down to the sea 47 years ago and had never really left it. Not on a tall ship, not as a sailor, but as a keeper of the light that helped those ships navigate. Different roles, same fundamental connection to the ocean and its mysteries. He read the poem through to its end, then sat with the book open in his lap, listening to the night sounds, feeling the peace of routine fulfilled, of duty performed, of another evening watch begun. Outside, the lighthouse beam swept around and around, cutting through the darkness, keeping its promise, maintaining its vigil. Inside, the keeper rested, waiting for the next check, the next task, the next moment when his presence and his care would be needed. The night continued, peaceful and quiet, and exactly as it should be. The hours between the 8 o'clock check and midnight passed in quiet contemplation. Thomas read a few more poems, then set the book aside and simply sat, listening to the sounds of the lighthouse at night. The wind had picked up slightly, creating a low whistle as it moved around the tower. The waves sounded louder in the darkness, their rhythm more pronounced when unaccompanied by visual distraction. At 10:30, Thomas prepared a light snack, some crackers with cheese, an apple from his stores. He ate slowly, without hurry, then cleaned up and returned everything to its proper place. The routine of keeping everything organized and clean was so ingrained now that he performed these tasks without conscious thought, his hands knowing exactly where each item belonged. The moon had climbed high in the sky by now, past its zenith and beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Its light flooded through the small windows of the lighthouse, casting geometric patterns across the floor, rectangles and trapezoids of silver light that shifted slowly as the moon moved. Thomas stood in one of these pools of moonlight and held out his hand, watching the way the pale light illuminated his skin, making it seem almost translucent. His hand was an old man's hand now, the skin thin and marked with age spots, the veins prominent, the knuckles slightly swollen from decades of work. But it was still a capable hand, still able to polish a lens, to trim a wick, to fulfill its duties. He thought about aging, about the way the body gradually wore down despite the mind's willingness to continue. His knees ached more now. His back stiffened if he sat too long. His eyes tired more quickly when reading or doing close work. These were inevitable changes, the price of living long enough to experience them. The Lighthouse service would eventually require him to retire. There were age limits, medical examinations, standards that had to be met. Thomas had passed his last physical examination without difficulty, but he knew that couldn't continue indefinitely. At some point, probably within the next few years, a doctor would determine he was no longer fit for duty, and that would be that. What would he do then? The thought troubled him more than he liked to admit. This lighthouse, this work, this routine, it had become so completely his life that he struggled to imagine existence beyond it. Retired to where? To do what? He had no family, few friends, no hobbies beyond his carving and his beachcombing. The lighthouse was everything, but perhaps that was a problem for future Thomas to solve. For now, he was still capable, still performing his duties competently, still keeping the light burning night after night. He would continue until he couldn't, and then he would face whatever came next. Thomas checked his watch. 11:45. Nearly time for the midnight check. He pulled on his canvas jacket. The night was cold now, and the lantern room would be cooler than it had been during the evening check, and began the climb. The stairs seemed steeper at night, or perhaps he was simply more tired. Thomas climbed slowly, pausing at the usual intervals to catch his breath. The stone walls radiated cold, and his breath formed visible clouds in the beam of his small flashlight. At the top, the lantern room was indeed cooler, though still warmed by the lamp's continuous burning. Thomas went through his checklist with the thoroughness of long practice. Fuel level, exactly where it should be. Wick condition, burning evenly with minimal carbon buildup. Flame quality, steady and bright. Glass chimney, some haze had accumulated, and Thomas carefully cleaned it with a soft cloth. Rotation mechanism, clicking smoothly, the weight descended about halfway down its shaft. Everything functioning perfectly, as it had been for 47 years under his care, as it had been for decades before him under previous keepers' care, as it would be for years to come under whoever succeeded him. Thomas moved to the windows and looked out at the night. The moonlight made everything visible, the sea, the coast, the distant shape of land masses. He scanned the horizon systematically, north to east to south to west, looking for ships. There, to the northeast, several miles out, the lights of a vessel. Red and green running lights visible, indicating it was heading generally southward. A smaller ship than the cargo vessel he'd spotted earlier, probably a fishing trawler working through the night. Thomas watched it for several minutes, confirming its course, assuring himself it was navigating safely. The vessel maintained a steady course parallel to the coast, staying well clear of the rocks and shoals that made this area hazardous. Satisfied, he continued his scan. To the south, nothing visible. To the west, only the moonlit sea stretching to the horizon. To the north, the distant lights of Harborside, most of the town dark now but a few lights still burning. The harbor lights, some street lights, perhaps a few homes where people kept late hours. The world continued its rhythms, even at midnight. People slept or worked night shifts or dealt with insomnia. Ships traversed the seas. The moon wheeled overhead. The earth turned. And here, in this lighthouse, Thomas Weatherby kept his watch, as he always had, as he always would for as long as he was able. He descended the stairs, his legs heavy with accumulated fatigue. Back in his living quarters, he noted the check in his journal. Midnight inspection complete, all systems normal, one vessel observed, then prepared for his brief sleep period. Thomas removed his boots and outer clothes, keeping his underlayers for warmth. He lay down on his bed, pulled the wool blanket over himself, and closed his eyes. Sleep came quickly, as it always did during these night periods. His body knew the routine, knew to rest efficiently during the available windows. He slept dreamlessly, deeply, his breathing slow and regular. The lighthouse stood watch while its keeper slept, the lamp burning faithfully, the lens turning steadily, the beam sweeping around and around through the darkness. At 3:55 in the morning, Thomas woke. He lay still for a moment, orienting himself, then rose and dressed. His body ached with the particular stiffness that came from sleeping in the cold hours before dawn, but he worked through it, moving carefully until his muscles loosened. He climbed the stairs for what would be his final check of the night. The pre-dawn was the coldest time, and Thomas felt it keenly as he ascended. The stone walls seemed to radiate chill, and even the effort of climbing couldn't quite warm him completely. In the lantern room, the lamp still burned brightly, though the fuel level had dropped considerably. Thomas checked it carefully, still enough to last until dawn, still sufficient for the final hour or two of darkness. Perfect! The sky outside was still fully dark, but Thomas knew the character of that darkness was already beginning to change. Not visibly, not yet, but the earth was turning toward the sun, preparing for another day. In an hour, perhaps a bit more, the first hints of dawn would appear on the eastern horizon. Thomas completed his check, everything functioning normally, and descended the stairs. At the bottom, he decided not to return to bed. The remaining sleep period would be too brief to be restful, and sometimes broken sleep was worse than no sleep at all. Instead, he made coffee, the strong morning brew that would help him through the hours ahead. While the coffee percolated, he stood at the window and watched for the approach of dawn, for that subtle shift when the quality of darkness changed, when the stars began to fade, when the world prepared itself for light. The coffee finished brewing, and Thomas poured a cup. He carried it to his chair and sat, drinking slowly, warming his hands on the cup, feeling the caffeine begin its gentle work of wakefulness. Soon it would be dawn. Soon he would climb the stairs one more time and extinguish the lamp, completing another night's watch. Soon the sun would rise, and the cycle would begin again: morning maintenance, afternoon tasks, evening preparation, night watches. The routine was eternal, or felt that way. It had been his life for 47 years. It would continue to be his life until age or circumstance made it impossible. And then someone else would take up the duty, would climb these stairs, would polish this lens, would keep this light. The work was larger than any individual. That was comforting in its way. Thomas wasn't irreplaceable, no one was, but the work would continue. The light would shine night after night, long after Thomas Weatherby was forgotten, long after everyone who'd ever known him was gone. That was legacy enough. That was meaning enough. That was everything. Thomas finished his coffee and waited for the dawn, patient and content, a keeper of the light in the final hours of his watch. Through the window, the first hint of gray appeared on the eastern horizon. The stars began to fade, the brightest ones persisting, but the dimmer ones winking out one by one. The darkness loosened its hold, preparing to surrender once more to the day. Thomas rose, set down his cup, and began the final climb. Up the spiral stairs, 147 steps, his body protesting, but his will strong. At the top, he waited, watching the horizon, gauging the moment when natural light would be sufficient, when the lighthouse's duty would be fulfilled. The gray brightened to blue-gray. A thin line of gold appeared at the horizon's edge. The first rays of the sun reached out across the water, turning it from black to deep blue, from deep blue to blue-green. The moment came. Thomas turned the fuel control, reducing the flow. The flame diminished, wavered, and went out. The night watch was complete. Another dawn had come. Another day was beginning. Thomas noted the time, 6:11 a.m., and descended the stairs for the last time this cycle. At the bottom, he opened his logbook and recorded the night's completion. Then he closed the book, set down his pen, and stood looking upward through the center of the spiral staircase. 47 years. Thousands of nights. Millions of steps. Countless hours of vigilance. And he would do it all again tonight. And tomorrow night. And the night after that, for as long as he was able. This was his life. This was his purpose. This was enough. The lighthouse keeper's evening ritual would begin again when the sun touched the horizon. Until then, Thomas had a day to live, work to do, and a light to keep ready for the darkness that would inevitably return. The end.